Chapter 31, Satinel. The peaceful atmosphere of the mountain mansion shattered the moment the communication crystal pulsed with its frantic, rhythmic alarm. Jay watched the color drain from Lavinia's face, her sapphire eyes widening as she absorbed the frantic report coming from the other end. "Tobio and Natsum are fighting with Satinel," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly with a mix of fear and adrenaline. "He has been found. They are in the forest near the northern shrine district." Jay set his teacup down on the wooden veranda. Initially, his instinct was to remain detached. He had no loyalty to the Grigori and even less interest in the internal politics of fallen angels. But then he looked at Lavinia. She was already moving her fingers, tracing a circle in the air to initiate a teleportation spell. She was still recovering and her mana reserves barely half full, yet she didn't hesitate for a second. "The coordinates," Jay said, standing up and brushing the crumbs of his snack off his black shirt. "Give them to me." Lavinia paused, looking at him with surprise. "Ilyakuin? You don't have to do this. This is a Grigori and Grauzauberer matter. You're going regardless of what I say, aren't you?" Jay asked rhetorically. "And since you're still a mess both physically and mana, I'd rather not have to explain to Glenda why her favorite pupil got herself killed while I was drinking tea. I've visited that district during my patrols. I can teleport there instantly." He didn't wait for her to argue. He reached out and grabbed her hand, his own mana surging forward to hijack her spell. He refined the messy, frantic calculations she was making and anchoring them to a specific clearing he had scouted during his first week of Kyoto visit. Even though Lavinia had been a magician longer than he had, when it came to spatial magic, he was confident he could hold a candle to anyone in the world. With a sudden violent ripple in space, the mountain mansion vanished, replaced by the dense humid greenery of the Kyoto woods. They materialized near the fight located. The clearing was a chaotic mess of gouged earth and shattered timber. In the center of the fray, Tobio Accuse was barely holding his ground. He was accompanied by a massive, terrifying creature made of solid shadows, a canine beast that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. This was Jean, the manifestation of his Longinus, Canis Lycaon. The shadow dog moved with predatory grace, wielding blades of darkness from its paws and mouth, clashing against a barrage of golden light spears. Natsum Managawa and Cookie Samejima were also there, engaged in a desperate struggle against two other men. These weren't fallen angels, but humans wielding twisted, artificial sacred gears. They were the Nephilim Abyss, a rogue splinter group formed by the man himself. They are Satinel's followers. Jay watched the fight for a moment, his eyes scanning the battlefield with clinical detachment. He remembered Azazel mentioning a school called the Nephilim, an institution built by the Grigori to train and protect human sacred gear users. Jay had been cynical about it at first, assuming Azazel was just harvesting talent for his own ends. But seeing Tobio and the others fight with such disciplined coordination made him realize that Azazel had actually given these kids a fighting chance in a world that would otherwise have devoured them. His opinion of the Governor-General shifted a few degrees higher. "He's still an annoying eccentric man, though that won't change." Lavinia didn't stay to spectate. She lunged forward, her summer dress fluttering behind her like a pale cloud. She was an incongruous sight in a war zone, but the power she wielded was anything but delicate. "Absolute demise," she cried out. A wave of crystalline frost swept across the clearing. It moved with the speed of a landslide, instantly encasing the two Nephilim Abyss members in pillars of solid, unbreakable ice. They didn't even have time to scream before they were turned into frozen statues. "Lavinia!" Everyone's face lit up as the emergency support arrived. The sudden intervention caused the fight to freeze like the other two men. Satinel, a man with a regal, arrogant face and 12 wings of midnight black, turned his gaze toward the newcomers. Jay looked at Satinel. He is a tall man dressed in some sort of fallen angel battlesuit, having brown hair, silver eyes, and masculine facial features. He didn't look panicked at the sight of his subordinates being neutralized. In fact, a thin, amused smile played across his lips. "The Ice Princess of Absolute Demise and the Scorch Magician of the Incinerate Anthem," Satinel said, his voice smooth and resonant. "It is truly an honor to meet you both on such a fine evening." Lavinia narrowed her eyes, her breath coming in short, frosty puffs. She stood in front of Tobio and Natsum, her icy mana forming a protective mist around them. Jay, however, remained in the back. He stood with his hands in his pockets, leaning against a half-broken cedar tree. His casual attire made him look more like a tourist who had taken a wrong turn than a Longinus wielder who just got famous in Japan. Paddock on his wrist though. He watched Satinel with deep interest. According to Azazel, this man had once been a respected teacher at the Nephilim school. But his obsession with the evolution of sacred gears had turned him into a fanatic. He had taken his most promising students and vanished into the shadows to form the Abyss team. "Why are you doing this, Satinel?" Tobio demanded, his shadow dog growling beside him. "Why?" Satinel asked quietly. "Let me ask you something," Tobio accused. "Why do you think God granted humans the sacred gears?" "To protect the ones you love," Tobio replied. "And to survive." Satinel laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Protection? Is that what Azazel taught you?" he said. What a pitiful interpretation. The sacred gears were not gifts of mercy. They were a final legacy left by my father, a tools left behind to accelerate humanity's evolution. His gaze hardened. "My intent is divine, Tobio. I seek to artificially stimulate the growth of these gears, to force the birth of more Longinus. Humanity requires weapons capable of killing gods, no matter the chaos such a process may unleash." He spread his wings slightly, shadows folding around him. "Order is a crutch for the weak. Only through disorder can true strength be forged." He turned his gaze toward Lavinia and Tobio, ignoring Jay entirely. "Join me. Both of you possess the potential to transcend your current limits. Join the Abyss and I will help you master the Canis Lycaon and absolute demise. I will show you how to turn those sparks into a fire that will consume the heavens and devils." His voice lowered, almost earnest. "I am doing this for you too, for humanity." "You're insane," Natsum spat, her whip cracking the air. "You're just sacrificing people for your own ego." Before Satinel could respond, the air in the clearing thickened. Two more figures emerged from a shimmer of light. One was Azazel, his usual smirk replaced by a mask of cold fury. Beside him was a tall, imposing man with a jagged scar running down his face and an aura that crackled with electricity. This was Barakil, one of the leaders of the Grigori. Satinel's grin widened. "Now this is quite a gathering, isn't it? Azazel and even Barakil has graced us with his presence." "Satinel, it's over," Azazel said, his voice echoing through the woods. "Your allies are gone. The Utsasimi agency has been dismantled, and the Wizards of Oz have retreated. There is no one left to support your delusions. Surrender now and we will spare your life. You will face judgment within the Grigori accordingly." The mention of surrender caused Satinel's expression to shift. The amusement vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged rage that radiated from his black wings. "Judgment? From you?" Satinel roared. "The Grigori have lost their way under your leadership, Azazel. You have allowed yourselves to be left out by the heavens and mocked by the devils. You limit yourselves with morality and human sentimentality. You are attached to this pathetic human race like a parasite to its host. Under your rule, the Grigori will crumble into dust the moment the Great War resumes. I won't let that happen. With the sacred gears, the legacy of our father, I will be the one who ensures our survival. No matter how many humans I have to sacrifice, I will be the one who continues his Liga." The speech ended abruptly. There was no explosion, no flash of light, and no dramatic final clash. Rupture. The air in front of Satinel's face suddenly folded. A jagged, invisible tear appeared in the fabric of reality, slicing through the space where Satinel's neck was positioned. In a fraction of a second, the fallen angel's head was severed and erased from existence. The headless body remained floating for a heartbeat, the momentum of his speech still vibrating in his chest. Then the realization of death caught up with physics. The body collapsed and falling to the forest floor like a lifeless bird, its 12 black wings tangling in the dirt. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the clearing stood frozen, eyes wide as they stared at the twitching remains of one of the former leaders of the Grigori. Satinel might not have been the strongest, as battle was never his forte, but he had still been powerful. And now only his lifeless body lay on the ground. They turned as one to look at Jay, who was calmly lowering his hand. What did you just do?" Barakil shouted, his voice cracking with shock. He took a step toward Jay, his hands crackling with lightning. "What did you do to my brother?" Azazel held out an arm, stopping Barakil from lunging forward. His own face was a study in conflict. He had been planning to capture Satinel, to perhaps find a way to redeem him or at least keep him as a prisoner. After all, they are still brothers for eons. He hadn't expected someone to simply execute him in the middle of a sentence. What do you think? Maybe because he killed humans, plotted this Utsasimi nonsense, caused chaos everywhere, and was probably planning something even more devious for the future? But I don't know, Jay asked rhetorically, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Azazel and Barakil found themselves unable to respond. The logic was brutal, yet undeniably true. Satinel was too dangerous to be kept alive, and he was too far gone to ever be a comrade again. Jay's pragmatism was jarring, a sharp contrast to the complex moral codes the Grigori or even a normal human lived by. Suddenly, a new voice drifted through the trees, calm and melodic. "So that is the power of the Scorch Magician," the voice said. "I am truly honored to meet all of you under such dramatic circumstances." Everyone turned toward the edge of the forest. Emerging from the shadows was an exceptionally beautiful young woman. She was of Japanese descent, with long, flowing black hair and piercing red eyes. She had a slim, voluptuous figure that was highlighted by her traditional yet modified attire. Beside her stood a handsome young man with spectacles and graceful features, wearing a blue blazer that looked far too formal for a forest. Everyone reacted differently, but the most noticeable reaction came from Barakil. Barakil's eyes widened, his anger momentarily forgotten. He looked at the girl as if he had just seen a ghost, his hands trembling slightly. The young woman stepped into the light, bowing with a grace that felt ancient and refined. "My name is Suzaku Himejima," she said, her voice carrying an unmistakable authority. "I am the heir of the vermilion bird of the Himejima clan. And we have something to discuss regarding the events that have transpired in our territory." Chapter 32, 5 Principal Clans. The silence following the violent deletion of Satinel's head was heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of blood. The two newcomers at the edge of the clearing did not seem bothered by the gruesome sight. The young woman, her long black hair swaying slightly in the breeze, stepped forward first. Her red eyes scanned the gathered crowd with a calm, analytical grace. "Allow me to introduce myself," she began, her voice like silk over stone. "I am Suzaku Himejima, the current heir of the Vermilion Bird. And this is Sairyu Kushihashi, the current heir of the Azure Dragon." The man beside her, a handsome youth with spectacles, gave a polite, measured bow. He looked more like a university student than a warrior of an ancient bloodline, but the aura radiating from him was steady and deep like a forest that had stood for 1,000 years. Suzaku's gaze shifted to Tobio Accuse. A soft, almost sisterly smile touched her lips. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, Tobio. It is rare for a fellow Himejima, even one who has been banished from the house, to manifest a Longinus of such caliber." Tobio tightened his grip on the shadow blades manifested by his companion, Jean. "I am not Himejima, it was my grandmother's family." Suzaku nodded with understanding. The Himejima are a strict clan, perhaps the most rigid of the Godai Soke. We adhere strictly to the tenets of Shintoism and harbor a deep historical dislike for any external religious practices. This includes Buddhism, which we view as a corruption of the pure path. Years ago, when Suu Himejima took the mantle as the head of the clan, he instituted a purge. He banished those who could not receive the blessings of the Shinto gods and exiled anyone who diverted from our teachings. Your grandmother, Ajihar Accuse, was cast out for the crime of learning and practicing Buddhistic magic. Azazel, who had been listening intently while leaning over Satinel's headless remains, finally spoke up. "That's a fascinating history lesson, Suzaku Himejima. But it doesn't explain why the heirs of the two principal clans are taking the time to meet us here, in a forest before the official trial has even begun. Isn't that a breach of protocol?" Suzaku's expression turned serious. She looked at Sairyu, who gave a brief nod of permission. "We are here because the internal politics of the 5 principal clans are not as unified as they appear on the surface. We actually want to clarify something, Governor General." Suzaku then continued, "The Himejima, the Kushihashi, the Dumen and the Shinra are not the ones who initiated this trial." This caused a ripple of surprise through the group. Even Jay, who had been staring off into the sky, turned his head to listen. "It was the Nikiri clan," Suzaku continued. "They have been the sole driving force behind these legal demands. They have chosen to ignore the fact that the Grigori, the Ice Princess, and the Scorch Magician have provided a tremendous service to us and Japanese people by neutralizing the threat of the Utsusimi. Suzaku looked at the lifeless body of Satinel and said, "And Satinel?" She paused, then lowered her head in a profound bow of gratitude toward everyone present. "On behalf of the more moderate factions of the Godaisok, I thank you for your actions. We do not wish for the Grigori or the Grau Zauberer to harbor ill will toward us because of how this matter is being handled." Azazel narrowed his eyes. "Why are you going this far to turn on your own? The Nikiri are technically your allies in the Shinto faction. Helping us like this is a dangerous game for you to play." "We are doing this because of what lies within Tobio's sacred gear," Suzaku said, her eyes meeting Tobio's. "Jean?" Tobio asked, his shadow dog let out a low, confused growl. What could the Nikiri possibly want with him? Suzaku looked around the clearing, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do any of you know the history of the Japanese four divine swords, the Tatsuka no Tsurugi?" Natsum, who had been standing silently by Tobio's side, stepped forward. "I know them. They are the blades used by the gods in the Age of Myths. There is the Snakeslayer sword, Aim no Habakiri. There is the Cloud-Gathering sword, Aim no Murakumo. There is Takamikazuchi's blade, the Futsunamatama no Tsurugi. And the last one is Aim no Ohabari," Suzaku finished for her. "The very sword that Tobio manifested during his fight against Hanazu Himejima." Tobio looked down at his hands. "The sword from my gear? How is that a problem? It's part of my power." "The Nikiri believe otherwise," Suzaku explained. "The current head of the Nikiri family views the divine swords as the property of the Shinto gods, and by extension, the property of the 5 principal clans. They intend to use this trial to claim that sword for themselves, arguing that a banished individual has no right to wield a relic of the national heavens. Furthermore, I believe there is an external influence at work. Someone has been whispering in the ears of the Nikiri leadership and nudging them to conduct this trial as a way to weaken the Grigori's influence in Japan." She looked at Jay and Lavinia specifically. "Be careful during the meeting. The Nikiris know. Even some of the current head are not looking for justice, they are looking for a confession of theft. Do not give them an inch." That declaration left everyone deep in thought. "That's all I wanted to say. Let's meet again in 3 days. Good afternoon." With those cryptic words, Suzaku and Sairyu vanished back into the shadows of the forest, leaving the group in a state of bewildered silence. "Why would she tell us all of that?" Natsum asked, looking at the spot where the Himejima heir had stood. "Isn't she basically just betrayed her own faction?" Azazel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's risky, but I think she's playing the long game. Think about it from her perspective. If you were the future head of a clan, would you want to start your reign by making enemies of 3 Longinus users at the same time? One of whom just decapitated a high-ranking fallen angel with a flick of his wrist." Azazel took a shot to Jay which he just ignored. While Tobio, Natsum and Samejima nodded with understanding. Lavinia nodded in understanding. "It is a risky but a brilliant diplomatic move. By warning us, she ensures that if the trial turns into a disaster, we won't blame the Himejima or the Kushihashi or even the others. She's insulating the next generation from the mistakes of the current one." Barakil, who had been uncharacteristically silent since Suzaku's arrival, stared at the ground. "Shuri," he muttered under his breath. Azazel looked at his comrade with a pang of sympathy. He knew that Suzaku's resemblance to Shuri Himejima, Barakil's late wife, must have been like a knife to the heart. The Himejima bloodline was strong and Suzaku's face resembles the woman Barakil had loved and lost. Azazel then turned his attention to Jay, who was already starting to walk away with Lavinia, who bid farewell to Tobio and the others. "You know, Jay, I would appreciate it if you notified me before you decide to execute my subordinates in front of me." Jay didn't even turn around. He just raised a hand in a dismissive wave. "Do a better job of handling your subordinates then, Governor General." The retort left Azazel speechless. He watched as Jay and Lavinia disappeared into a ripple of spatial magic, heading back toward their mountain mansion. The governor sighed, looking down at Satinel's lifeless body. He reached down and picked it up with a grimace. "Even with the source of the chaos gone, things feel like they're just getting started," Azazel remarked to the empty forest. He signaled to Tobio and the others, and in a flash of light, the clearing was empty, leaving only the gouged earth as a reminder of the battle. The 3 days following the encounter in the woods were surprisingly peaceful. Lavinia decided to move out of the Grigori facility and into the mountain mansion with Jay. She said she would try to help him with his study of thaumaturgy as it interested her. He didn't mind the company. In fact, he found that her presence made the tedious process of runic validation much faster. Her deep knowledge of absolute demise and other various magical branch overall provided a unique perspective on energy containment that Jay hadn't considered. Even more shockingly, Lavinia understood Zoroaster runes, as many of them were studied within the Grauzoberer. They spent hours in the sun-drenched veranda in the mansion, parchment scattered across every available surface. Jay would draft a pattern for a high-temperature seal and Lavinia would critique the flow of mana, often suggesting ways to use cold runic logic to stabilize the hot output of the Incinerate Anthem. On the morning of the 3rd day, a sleek black limousine arrived at the gates of the mountain estate. It was Suzaku and Sairyu, sent to escort them to the heart of the Shinto territories in Nara. Jay looked at the car with a flat expression. A limousine? Really? It's for the sake of formality, Suzaku said as she stepped out to greet them. She was dressed in a formal kimono today, the vibrant white and red of the fabric matching the intensity of her eyes. We are entering the inner sanctuary. It is a place of tradition. Teleporting directly into the heart of the clan grounds would be seen as an act of war. Jay sighed, following Lavinia into the plush interior of the vehicle. He hadn't sat in a car for months. Ever since he had mastered long-range teleportation, the idea of traveling at 60 miles per hour felt agonizingly slow. He crossed his arms and stared out the window as the car began its way to Nara Prefecture. The ride was quiet at first. Suzaku chatted lightly with Lavinia about the differences between Western magic and Eastern Shinto magic, while Sairyu acted as the silent driver. Jay remained a silent observer until Suzaku turned her attention toward him. So, may I ask your name? I realize we were interrupted before we could speak properly, Suzaku said. Zayyn, Jay replied, his voice short. Nice to meet you, Zayyn. But if you don't mind me being so blunt, I have to ask. How old are you? Lavinia looked at Jay, her curiosity piqued as well. She knew he was younger than her, but they had never actually discussed his age. Jay didn't see any reason to lie. 14, Jay said. The silence that followed was so profound that Jay could hear the hum of the car's engine. 14? Sairyu, whose silence before opened his mouth, his voice was filled with disbelief. Are you kidding me? Suzaku's eyes widened, her composure slipping for the first time. So young. And yet your name is already being whispered in the halls of the clans. Even Lavinia was surprised. 14, she thought. From the 3 days she had spent living with Jay, one thing was clear: he was a genius. Even among the most talented and so-called prodigies of Grauzoberer, there was no doubt that, in terms of pure understanding of magic, the young boy before her was unparalleled. No wonder Ashisha-sama took him as her disciple, Lavinia whispered to herself, a sense of awe washing over her. Suzaku eventually regained her smile, though it was now tinged with a new layer of respect. She spent the rest of the journey explaining the cultural significance of the territory they were entering. The Nara prefecture was considered the cradle of the 5 principal clans, a place where the barrier between the mortal world and the spirit realm was paper-thin. As they crossed the invisible boundary into the clan territories, a sudden sensation assailed their bodies. It was a wave of feverish chills that felt like jumping into a pool of ice water. We will arrive very soon, Suzaku asserted. Lavinia felt the ripples in the air. A mystic barrier, huh? A multi-layered one at that. As expected of a high-ranking magician from Grauzoberer. Suzaku noted. Yes, we are passing through the first of 7 seals that protect the inner sanctuary. Each one is designed to strip away the mana of unwelcome guests. Since you are with us, the barrier only registers as a slight chill. Jay made a mental note to study the frequency of the chills. He had realized that this problem has occurred because during his fight with Augusta that he lacked effective barrier magic to contain their fight in the first place. The car passed through several more layers of chills before finally slowing down. The heavy creaking of massive wooden gates echoed through the valley. The main gate is opening, Suzaku said. The car resumed its motion, traveling along a winding path lined with ancient cedar trees. Minutes passed and they were still moving. Even though we've passed the main gate, the car is still going? Lavinia asked, looking out at the endless forest. The inner sanctuary is pointlessly spacious, Suzaku said apologetically. It encompasses an entire mountain range that has been hidden from human maps for centuries. It will only take a little longer. Finally, the limousine came to a gentle stop in front of a gigantic residence. It was a masterpiece of old-world architecture, a sprawl of elegant wooden halls and tiled roofs that seemed to blend perfectly into the mountain face. When the doors were opened, Jay stepped out and was immediately struck by the sheer scale of the reception. People were lined up on either side of the path leading to the residence. On the left, men and women in the white and red robes of Shinto priests stood with their heads bowed. On the right, a line of soldiers in crisp modern military uniforms stood at attention, their expressions stony and disciplined. Lavinia. Zayyn. A familiar voice called out from the entryway. Jay saw Tobio, Azazel, Natsum and Samejima waiting for them. Barakil was there as well, looking grim. Beside them was a young girl with short hair who Jay recognized as Sae Tiju. She had finally regained consciousness after the ordeal with the Utsusimi. Jay noticed that Tobio, Natsum and Sae were all wearing strange ornate rings on their fingers. What are the toys for? Jay asked as they reached the group. They're spirit-binding rings, Azazel explained, his tone unusually dry. Duman and Shinra insisted on them as a condition for entry. They reached the entryway of the main house. It was an old Japanese structure, but its interior was vast. The entry hall alone was the size of a small gymnasium, the floors covered in pristine tatami mats that smelled of fresh straw. As they stepped further inside, the air became heavy. A thick, oppressive pressure began to weigh down on their shoulders, a physical manifestation of a powerful aura. Standing at the far end of the entry hall was a man who seemed to be the source of the pressure. He wore a sharp military uniform adorned with medals, but it was his gaze that was truly intimidating. His eyes were like those of a predator, sharp and unyielding, analyzing every person who entered his domain. Azazel Dano, I apologize for the wait, the man said, his voice booming through the hall. I am the current head of the Nikiri family, Nikiri Nakagami no Uryu. I serve as the chief of the sacred beast bearers and the protector of this sanctuary. His eyes swept over the group, lingering on Tobio and Lavinia before finally settling on Jay. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, not fear, but a cold, calculating curiosity. And welcome to the Ice Princess, the Black Dog and the Scorch Magician, Nikiri said, his lips curling into a stiff, formal smile. Welcome to the inner sanctuary. Let's start the trials.
Wait! Hold up. Stop for a sec. Look, if you've already made it this far into the video and you're still here, come on, subscribe, bro. All right, I see you rolling your eyes. I'm moving. I'll get out of the way now so you can get back to the good stuff. But seriously, stick around and finish listening. It's worth it.
Chapter 33, Trials. The atmosphere within the entrance hall of the Nikiri residence was thick enough to stifle a normal human. Nikiri Nakagami no Uryu stood as a pillar of concentrated authority. He was the youngest head in the history of the Nikiri clan and whispered to be the strongest warrior they had produced in generations. He radiated a peculiar kind of pressure, a mixture of modern military discipline and ancient spirit-touched power. Azazel being the diplomat, he has stepped forward. He didn't seem bothered by the heavy aura. Instead, he wore a casual, slightly tired smile that suggested he had seen far more intimidating things in his several millennia of existence. Nice to meet you, Uryu Dano, Azazel said, extending a hand. I've heard much about the outstanding talent by which you succeeded the Nikiri family at such a young age. I've been looking forward to this meeting, though perhaps under less litigious circumstances. Uryu took the hand. The grip was firm, a silent test of will. It is I who should say so, Governor General. It is the greatest honor to be able to meet the governor of Grigori. Your reputation for unconventionality precedes you. Uryu's eyes shifted then, moving past Azazel to scan the three Longinus wielders standing behind him. He lingered on Tobio with a look of professional scrutiny, acknowledged Lavinia with a nod of respect, and finally stopped at Jay. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the 14-year-old's relaxed posture and paddock on his wrist. Wearing only a zip-up black hoodie and a baggy jeans in such official meeting is a slight disrespect in his eyes, but Uryu decided to let it go. "I am sorry," Uryu said, his voice regaining its stiff formality. "But the elders are waiting. Let us hurry." Under the guidance of Uryu, Suzaku, and the rest of the sacred beast bearers, the group set foot deeper into the residence. The walk lasted for nearly 10 minutes. The interior of the residence was a labyrinth of polished dark wood, sliding paper doors, and long, silent passages. Every few dozen meters, the air would ripple with the presence of another hidden barrier. It was an excessively spacious layout, designed to disorient and intimidate. By the time they reached their destination, most of the teens felt as though they had walked into another dimension entirely. Finally, Uryu led them through a set of ornate fusuma doors. They stepped into a banquet hall that was staggering in its proportions. It was over 100 tatami mats in size, a sea of pristine straw flooring illuminated by soft, recessed lighting. At the far end of the room there was an elevated section, a raised floor that stood about half a meter higher than the rest of the hall. A thick, semi-transparent bamboo curtain hung from the ceiling, shielding the figures on the upper level from view. Uryu, Suzaku, and the other heirs moved to their designated spots. They knelt on small, rectangular carpets woven with their respective clan crests. These were not the common zabuton cushions used by commoners, they were symbols of high social standing and ancient lineage. With practiced grace, the heirs bowed their heads until they nearly touched the floor. Even the aggressive Shinra Byako, who had spent the morning looking like he wanted to bite someone, sat in respectful silence. Uryu spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "We have accompanied the governor of Grigori, as well as the 3 Longinus wielders, including one of our own blood, accused Tobio." A moment of silence followed. Then a voice drifted from behind the curtain. It wasn't the voice of one person, but a discordant harmony of several elderly speakers. Good. Your efforts have been much appreciated, Uryu and all of the 4 divine beasts. You have served the sanctity of our borders well." The voice then turned toward the guests. "Governor Azazel and everyone else as well, please be seated." Tobio, Natsum, Samejima, and even Lavinia moved to find their places. They sat in the traditional Seiza position, a posture of formal respect and discipline. Even Azazel, despite his internal sigh, began to lower himself to the floor. Then there was Jay. Jay remained standing. He stood in the middle of the hall with his hands shoved casually into his baggy jeans pockets. He looked around the room as if he were inspecting a museum exhibit rather than participating in a divine tribunal. "Illya-kun?" Lavinia whispered, looking up at him with concern. "The Scorch Magician," Uryu's voice came out low and dangerous. "Is there something wrong? Do you find our customs beneath you?" The heirs and the invisible elders focused their collective attention on the boy. The pressure in the room spiked, a physical weight intended to crush his defiance. Azazel simply face-bombed, closing his eyes in resignation. He knew Jay was many things, but compliant was never one of them. Jay didn't look at Uryu. He didn't even look at the heirs. He kept his eyes on the curtain. "Let's cut the bullshit," Jay said. His voice was flat, cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a cold blade. "Azazel, have you sent my message?" Azazel looked up with a defeated smile. "I did. Though I suspect they didn't take it as the helpful suggestion you intended it to be." "Then let's begin the trials," Jay said. As the word trials left his lips, a sudden localized burst of intense purple heat erupted from the center of the room. It wasn't a massive explosion, but a surgical strike of mana. The bamboo curtain at the far end of the hall was instantly reduced to fine gray dust. The figurative holy barrier concealing the elders reduced to dust in an instant. The 4 heads of the clans were revealed, old men and women dressed in elaborate robes, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute shock and mounting fury. Jay hadn't just spoken, but he had committed a blatant act of hostility. "You!" one of the elders roared, standing up in a blur of motion. His aura flared, swirling around his fists. "You dare commit such sacrilege in the inner sanctuary?" Jay didn't waver. He didn't even take his hands out of his pockets. "The Scorch Magician," Uryu opened his mouth, his voice trembling with restrained rage. "We will not tolerate any more disrespect toward our elders. If you will not be seated, I will have to force you into a position of humility." Jay ignored him and as his eyes scanning the elders. "You're wasting my time. I didn't come here to play pretend." Let's be straightforward. What are the 5 principal clans actually aiming for with this trial? One of the elders, a man with a face like withered parchment, regained his voice. He slammed his hand onto the raised floor. What do we aim for? We aim for justice. Your actions and reckless battle against the Ice Princess and the actions of the Grigori have endangered the livelihood of Japanese civilians. You brought the flames of a foreign conflict into our sacred grounds. Endangered? Jay repeated the word with a sarcastic tilt to his head. Ah. Are you talking about the fact that one of your own, Hanazu Himejima, was conspiring with the Wizard of Oz and a traitor of the Grigori? Are you referring to the human experiments that killed dozens of people right under your noses? Is that the endangerment you're so concerned about? Insolent brat, another elder shouted, rising to her feet. Hanazu Himejima had been cast out. His action fall outside of our jurisdiction. Some of the elders shouted at Jay and began preparing to attack him. But both Jay and Azazel knew that those old men could not actually do anything. Azazel was not worried about Jay being attacked. Instead, he was worried that the boy standing before him might actually kill them. Azazel was someone who could judge people fairly easily, and one thing had become clear to him about Jay. This young man lived by a set of twisted morals. One principle always stood out. Jay despised authority that preyed upon the weak. That was why he killed Satinel. And yet he operated within your borders for years, Jay countered. So tell me, if his actions were not under your jurisdiction, then what gives you the right to judge me for cleaning up your mess? Where were the great clans when the Utsusemis were kidnapping children in broad daylight? Where was your so-called divine duty when those children were being experimented on in the mountains inside your country? The room fell into a stunned silence. The truth was a jagged thing, and Jay was driving it into the heart of their pride. The reason those activities even stopped, Jay continued, his voice growing colder, is because of the brave actions of these kids you're now trying to intimidate. Jay said, pointing at Tobio and his friends, and then he pointed at Azazel and Lavinia. It's because of the Grigori and Grauzoperer. You sat in your mountain fortress and did nothing while your own blood turned into monsters. He continued. He turned his gaze slowly across the 4 divine beasts, then back to the elders. Inefficient. Useless. Old-fashioned. That is what you are. Resign from your position in shame for the incompetence and the breaking of the oaths you swore. You claim to protect the lives of humans from supernatural threats, yet you only show up when there's a Longinus to be claimed or a reputation to be salvaged. The sentence felt like a final judgment. The veins on the elders' foreheads were bulging, their faces turning a deep, humiliated red. Enough. Uryu shouted. He didn't wait for a command. He lunged forward, his speed surpassing the perception of the human eye. He reached for Jay's neck, his hand wreathed in the crushing pressure of the earth element. He intended to pin the boy to the tatami mats and force him to understand the weight of the Nikiri name. But as Uryu's hand closed, it met no resistance. His fingers passed through Jay's throat as if he were reaching through a holographic projection. Uryu stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him past the spot where Jay stood. Jay remained exactly where he was, his body shimmering with a faint, spatial distortion of phantasmagoria. He had made himself intangible. Everyone stunned from the sudden actions that they are stopped moving. The silence that followed was broken not by an elder, but by a sudden booming laughter that echoed from the shadows behind the elevated floor. It was a deep resonant sound that made the very air in the hall vibrate. Kuhahaha. You are one interesting brat indeed. A figure emerged from the darkness behind the 4 elders. He was a tall, rugged man with wind-tossed dark hair and eyes that flickered with the intensity of a living storm. He wore a heavy, storm-patterned haori over dark combat attire, with ancient talismans bound at his wrists. His presence was overwhelming, carrying the restrained fury of a localized hurricane. The moment he appeared, the atmosphere in the room changed. The pressure from the Nikiri elders felt like a gentle breeze compared to the sheer power radiating from this man. Uryu immediately dropped to one knee, his head bowed. The other heirs and the elders followed suit, their arrogance replaced by a terrifying level of devotion. Susanu no Mikoto, Azazel whispered, his eyes narrowing as he stood up. He had suspected an external influence, but he hadn't expected a major god to descend into the mortal realm for a mere trial. Tobio, Natsum, and the others looked on in shock. This was the god of thunders and the sea, the legendary hero god of Shintoism himself. Kuhahaha. I should also say the same to you, Azazel, Susanu said, stepping forward until he stood at the edge of the raised floor. He ignored the kneeling elders as if they were furniture. It's been a few centuries since we last shared a drink. You're looking as tired as ever. What could be so important that you would bother coming down from Takamagara? Azazel asked. The 5 principal clans are usually beneath the direct notice of the gods. Susanu grinned, a predatory expression that suggested he found the entire situation hilarious. He raised a finger and pointed directly at Tobio Accuse. Oh, it's nothing complicated, Governor. Susanu said. His voice dropped an octave, becoming heavy with divine intent. I just came to get what is rightfully mine. The sword that inside the dog, the aim no Ohabari. He looked at Tobio, then at Jay, his lightning-bright eyes sparkling with a mix of greed and anticipation. The weapon of a god should not be wielded by a child of a banished line. I've come to reclaim the blade, and if anyone has an objection... He let out another short, barking laugh. Well, I haven't had a good fight in a long time. Chapter 34, Aim no Ohabari. The declaration from Susanu no Mikoto hung in the air like a localized storm front, heavy and suffocating. The blunt demand for its return sent a wave of cold dread through the group. And now everyone understand what Suzaku said a couple days earlier. Azazel was the first to break the silence. His casual demeanor had sharpened into something far more dangerous, his eyes narrowed as he assessed the god of storms. Susanudano, you know that is not possible, Azazel said, his voice dropping an octave. You are a god of this land. You know better than anyone that stripping a sacred gear from its host results in the immediate death of that host. You aren't just asking for a sword, you are asking for the boy's life. Susanu let out a dry, rasping chuckle that sounded like stones grinding together in a riverbed. He didn't look bothered in the slightest. I mean, if you can give the sword to me without needing to kill that brat, that would also be appreciated, Susanu replied, his eyes flickering with a predatory amusement. But I assume that even with all your tinkering in Grigori, you haven't found a way to bypass the soul bind of the God of the Bible. It is a messy business, I admit. But divine property is divine property, and it was, is, and will always be rightfully mine. Tobio Accuse instinctively pulled back, his arms wrapping around the flickering shadow form of Jean. The black dog let out a low, mournful growl, sensing the divine malice directed toward its core. Tobio's knuckles were white, his breath coming in shallow hitches. Anyway, Susanu continued, waving a hand dismissively as he turned his gaze to Azazel, since when did you care about these humans, Azazel? I thought you only had a soft spot for their women. Azazel didn't flinch. He adjusted his stance, shielding the teenagers behind him. Let's just say that I am a changed man. You know how a good woman can change your perspective on things. Kuhahaha. A fucking scary woman for sure can change a man, Susanu barked, his laughter booming through the hall. Azazel knew exactly who he was talking about. For a fleeting second, the tension seemed to bleed out of the room. It was the kind of banter shared between ancient powers who had seen civilizations rise and fall. But the relief was an illusion. In the world of the supernatural, the transition from a joke to an execution was swifter than a heartbeat. Suddenly, the air pressure in the meeting hall spiked. It wasn't just physical weight, it was a spiritual crushing force that felt like the atmosphere itself had turned to lead. The members of the 5 principal clans, already bowed, were forced even lower until their foreheads pressed painfully against the tatami mats. Tobio, Natsum, Samejima, and Sae were slammed to their knees, their lungs struggling to expand against the divine gravity. Lavinia stood her ground, her face pale and teeth clenched, her magical circuits screaming as they fought the suppression. Azazel remained upright, his 12 black wings shivering but held firm. And then there was Jay. He stood behind Azazel, his hands still tucked into the pockets of his black hoodie. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the god of storms with a clinical interest. At least ultimate class, Jay thought to himself. He could feel the raw, chaotic energy vibrating off Susanu, a fundamental force of nature that cared nothing for human logic. It is said that gods are born either from human belief or from natural laws, at least that is what Merlin believed. Susanu's eyes drifted over the survivors of his pressure, lingering on Jay with a look of genuine intrigue. A slow, sharp grin spread across the god's rugged face. As I thought, Susanu said, his voice booming. It is impressive how those Longinus can change the lives of these insects. A weapon of stolen divinity granted to human by a divinity to kill a divinity. It is almost poetic. The pressure relented slightly, allowing the children to gasp for air, though the atmosphere remained electric. Susanu stepped off the raised floor, his straw sandals clicking with a rhythmic finality as he approached Tobio. "The dog," Susanu rumbled. "Hand over the aim no habari now, boy." That blade was forged from the very essence of our heavens, tempered in the blood of the Izanagi lineage. It was stolen, carved away by that pagan god of yours and planted into that thing. He pointed a calloused finger at Jean. The shadow dog was flickering wildly now, its form unstable as if it were trying to hide within Tobio's shadow. The black dog is an abomination. A wretched creature born from a Greek myth, stitched together with Japanese divinity by a god who had no right to our legacy. It is a mongrel gear, a bastardized fusion of East and West. I will not have a divine sword of the Shinto realm rotting inside a shadow mutt. Tobio looked up, his eyes wet but burning with a fierce, desperate light. Stolen? Jean is my friend. He has been with me through everything. He protected me when no one else would. I didn't ask for this sword, but I won't just let you tear him apart. Susanu's grin didn't falter, but the light in his eyes turned to ice. I wasn't asking for permission, human. You are merely a vessel of something that is mine. In a blur of motion that bypassed the human eye, Susanu moved. He was a streak of blue lightning, a divine bolt aimed directly at Tobio's heart. Azazel, reacting with the speed of an ancient warrior, launched himself forward, but even he was a fraction of a second too slow to bridge the gap. However, Susanu didn't reach the boy. A jagged tear in the fabric of space manifested inches from Susanu's outstretched hand. It appeared like a vertical scar in the air, a void that consumed light, sound, and matter alike. The god of storms felt the terrifying suction of the spatial rift and twisted his body midair, his sandals skidding across the tatami as he retreated several meters back. The tear hissed, consuming every single air particle in its vicinity into absolute nothingness before it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The hall was silent. Every eye turned toward Jay, who was calmly walking forward until he stood directly in front of Tobio, shielding him from the god. Susanu's face contorted, his voice becoming a low, growling thunder that rattled the windows. You dare to rebel against a god, boy? Jay didn't flinch. He didn't even take his hands out of his pockets. He looked at Susanu. Where was this god when his toys were being stolen by the so-called pagan gods? Jay's voice was flat, devoid of the respect Susanu demanded. Oh wait, I know the answer. You were too weak to fight against the so-called pagan god when he took what was yours. All you can do now is wait centuries until the power is in the hands of a human so you can try to steal it back. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Azazel looked slightly panicked at the sheer audacity of Jay's words. Brat, Susanu hissed, the lightning at his wrists beginning to arc uncontrollably. There is a limit to the words of a human that I can tolerate. The Shinto god turned his gaze away from Jay, looking instead at the kneeling members of the 5 principal clans. His voice was no longer a rumble, it was a command that resonated in their very souls, a divine mandate they were biologically unable to refuse. Nikiri. Himejima. Kushihashi. Daemon. Shinra, Susanu barked. Your guest has proven himself to be a thief and an associate of heretics. The Scorch Magician has already desecrated this hall and insulted your forefather. Why do you remain on your knees? Cleanse this sanctuary. Purge the foreign influence from our mountains. Secure the black dog. The transformation was chilling. Uryu Nikiri rose first. His face was a battlefield of emotion, a mask of internal conflict that quickly smoothed into a grim, hollow determination. He was the head of the Nikiri, but before that he was a servant of the heavens. He could not disobey. Suzaku Himejima stood next. Her red eyes were shimmering with genuine regret as she looked at Tobio, but her hands were already igniting with the scorching red aura of the vermilion bird. I am sorry, Tobio-kun, Suzaku whispered, her voice trembling. Against a direct mandate from the forefather, we have no choice. The clans belong to the gods. Tisk, cowards, Jay whispered, his eyes narrowing. Pointing that at Susanu. The air in the room shifted as the other heirs stood, their mana flaring in a rainbow of elemental power. Sairyu Kushihashi's azure light, the white tiger's claws of the Shinra, and the water of the Daemon. Azazel stood tall, his 12 black wings unfurling to their full majestic span, casting a massive shadow over the room. Beside him, Barakiel's holy lightning began to crackle, matching the violent rhythm of the storm brewing outside. "So that's how it is," Azazel said, his tone no longer playful. "You are using these children as pawns to bypass the treaties between the Grigori and the Shinto faction. If you force them to attack us here, you think you can claim it was an internal clan matter. But let us be clear, Susanu. If you attack us, you are declaring war on the fallen." "Then let it be war," one of the elders shouted, leaping to his feet and pointing a shaking finger at Jay. "Kill the Scorch Magician. Secure the Black Dog as Susanu-sama commanded." The banquet hall exploded into a kaleidoscope of violence. The sacred beast wielders moved with terrifying coordination, their movements honed. Uryu Nikiri led the charge, his golden aura of the yellow dragon smashing into the center of the group like a falling star. Cookie Samejima stepped forward, his own sacred gear manifesting to catch Uryu's blow. The sheer physical force of the Nikiri head strike was immense, sending the teenager skidding backward, his feet tearing through the tatami mats until he slammed into a pillar. Natsume Managawa lashed out with her griffin as she engaged the Shinra heir's white tiger. The white tiger user moved like a blur of claws and predatory instinct, his strikes aimed at her vitals with a speed that forced the griffin to use every ounce its power. "Lavinia, watch the children," Azazel commanded, his hands glowing as he conjured spears of light to parry a barrage of spirit-sealing talismans. Lavinia didn't need to be told twice. She unleashed a burst of crystalline ice, her absolute demise creating a jagged, frost-covered barrier that separated Sei Tiju and the non-combatants from the initial wave of Shinto priests and soldiers. "Absolute demise!" she cried out, her frost creeping across the floor in intricate patterns, freezing the feet of the Kushihashi reinforcements and slowing the flow of mana in the room. Barakiel and Azazel met the elders and the senior clan members head-on. Barakiel's holy lightning was a jagged, violent contrast to the traditional Shinto charms flying through the air. He fought with a desperate ferocity even though his eyes constantly darting toward Suzaku. Every time he saw her face, he saw Shuri, and the pain of it fueled his strikes, even as he held back enough to ensure he didn't kill the girl who shared his wife's blood. In the center of this swirling vortex of fire, ice, and lightning, Jay remained a static point of absolute calm. He stood in front of Tobio, his eyes never leaving Susanu. The god had not yet joined the general fray. He was a spectator, watching his mortal subjects die for his whims. "You will die protecting that boy pointlessly, Scorch Magician," Susanu said, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "Is that so?" Jay replied. A sudden earth-shaking crackle of thunder erupted, not from within the room, but from the very foundations of the mountain. The sound was so immense that it shook the entire residence, causing everyone to pause for a fraction of a second. With a casual flick of his wrist, Susanu unleashed a wave of divine pressure that literally blew the walls of the banquet hall outward. The ornate wood and paper screens were shredded into toothpicks, revealing the dark forest of the inner sanctuary surrounding them. The spatial barriers that Jay had noted earlier and the 7 seals that protected the inner sanctuary were dismantled in an instant by their own creator. Susanu was done with the theater of a trial. He wanted an open battlefield. A dark blue lightning aura, thick and viscous like liquid, engulfed Susanu's body. He raised a hand toward the sky and for a moment, the clouds themselves seemed to descend. "Perish, heretics," Susanu muttered. With a violent swing of his arm, a giant pillar of thunder lunged from the heavens. It was a flash of white-blue light so bright it blinded everyone in the clearing, aimed to annihilate the entire group in a single strike. Even the members of the 5 principal clans were in the blast radius, but Susanu clearly didn't care for their lives any longer. Rupture. Before the lightning could make contact, a jagged tear in space appeared above the group. It was larger and more violent than the one before, acting like a cosmic drain. The massive thunderbolt was sucked into the rift as its energy deleted from existence before it could touch the ground. Jay stepped forward. His body began to glow with a faint, ominous purple hue, the light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. The air around him began to warp, creating a fata morgana, not from spatial magic, but from sheer unadulterated heat. "Incinerate Anthem," Jay muttered. The forest went silent as the purple flames began to flicker around his feet. Chapter 35, Susanu. The air within the barrier was no longer mere oxygen and nitrogen, it had become a conductive medium for the raw violent intent of two monsters. Jay stood amidst the scorched earth of the inner sanctuary, his black hoodie fluttering in the hot updraft created by his own presence. A flickering shroud of purple flames danced around his frame, casting long erratic shadows against the ancient trees. 50 feet away, Susanu no Mikoto stood with his arms crossed, his rugged features illuminated by the rhythmic pulsing of his own dark blue lightning. "To think a mere human could devise a logic to devour my lightning," Susanu remarked, his voice echoing with the resonance of rolling thunder. He was grinning, a sight that would have frozen the blood of most humans. "That rupture of yours, it didn't just block the strike but completely devoured it, such a magnificent use of spatial magic. You have a fine eye for the seams of the world, boy." Jay ignored the praise. He wasn't there for a lecture on his own mechanics. His eyes were fixed on the god's posture, his mind already running 1,000 simulations of the trajectories Susanu might take. He didn't look back as he spoke, his voice cold and commanding. "Azazel." The Governor-General, currently parrying a barrage of elemental talismans from the Himejima elders, glanced over his shoulder. "A bit busy here." "Put up a barrier," Jay ordered, his gaze never wavering from Susanu. Azazel's expression shifted from frantic to deadly serious. He recognized that tone immediately. Even if it was embarrassing for someone of his position to be ordered around by a human, let alone one so young, he understood the scale of the battle and the necessity of the barrier. "Understood. Don't let you get killed by him, all right?" Jay then shifted his attention to Tobio, who was standing paralyzed, his hands still gripped tightly around the shadow form of Jean. "Tobio, get moving. Go help the others." "I can't," Tobio shouted back, his voice cracking. "He's here because of me. Because of Jean. I can't just leave you to fight a god alone to protect me while I run away." Jay finally turned his head slightly, his hazel eyes glowing with a cold light that seemed to pin Tobio to the spot. "Do not misunderstand me," Tobio accused. "I am not standing against him for your sake. I fight because it is my creed, an oath I chose to bear and one I intend to see fulfilled. This is not justice, nor mercy, nor protection. It is a rule I imposed upon my own existence. The thing that even if I spent the next decade explaining it, you would not grasp it. Go." Tobio flinched, the harshness of the words cutting deeper than any blade. But then he noticed Jay's hands. They were not shaking at all. Tobio could not understand how someone who did not even look older than him could possess such resolve and courage. He wanted to be like him too, to protect Natsum, Sae, Samejima, and all of his friends. There was no fear in Jay's eyes, only a terrifying, clinical focus. Jean sensed the shift in the air and let out a sharp, encouraging bark toward Jay, a canine salute of fighting spirit, before nudging Tobio's hand. "Fine," Tobio hissed, his face hardening. "Just don't die on me, Jay. Promise." "I won't," Jay said. Tobio turned and vanished into the shadows, rushing toward the chaotic skirmish where Natsum, Samejima, and Lavinia were being pressed by the sheer numbers of the 5 principal clans. Azazel didn't waste a second. He flung using his 12 wings wide, and a massive, intricate magic circle of gold and violet began to cycle around Jay and Susanu. It expanded rapidly, carving out a combat zone hundreds of meters wide. The barrier was a masterwork of containment, designed to withstand the heat of a sun or the pressure of a collapsing star from supernatural beings. Susanu watched the barrier settle with a predatory grin. "A cage? How thoughtful. Now I don't have to worry about accidentally killing some ants." In the time it took for a human heart to beat once, Susanu ceased to be a man and became a lightning bolt. He blinked across the distance, his figure blurring into a streak of azure light. He appeared in front of Jay instantly and his fist already driving forward. It wasn't just a punch, the lightning aura surrounding his hand had sharpened into a puncturing spear of condensed thunder and storms, capable of piercing through dragon scales and divine armor alike. The strike hit. Or it should have. Susanu's fist passed through Jay's chest as if the boy were made of smoke. The lightning spear discharged behind Jay, obliterating a massive cedar tree and turning the earth into a molten crater, but Jay remained untouched as he activated Phantasmagoria. "Who?" Susanu hummed, his eyes widening in amusement. "You've turned yourself into a ghost. That's another interesting magic you have there." Jay didn't respond with words. He flickered out of existence and reappeared above Susanu, his hands wreathed in the purple flames of Incinerate Anthem. He unleashed a concentrated wave of purple flames meant to melt the god where he stood, but Susanu was a creature of the storm and lightning. He twisted his body with impossible fluidity, leaping back as the purple fire turned the air into a shimmering vacuum where he had been standing a microsecond before. Jay landed softly, but his eyes narrowed. He had reappeared 50 feet away, yet Susanu was already closing the gap again. His movement speed was encroaching on the response time of my domain. Jay thought. It was a dangerous realization. If Susanu moved faster than Jay's brain could process the spatial ripples, the intangibility of phantasmagoria would eventually fail. Jay teleported again, appearing directly behind Susanu. He didn't use fire this time. He reached out with a hand, the space around his fingers warping into a jagged rupture. He intended to end the fight by shearing through the god's spinal column before the deity could react. Susanu, however, possessed the instincts of a being who had fought primordial monsters. He felt the ripple in the space behind him. Without turning, he moved forward, and in a flash of light, 3 colossal eastern dragon heads made of condensed lightning manifested from his aura. They lunged backward toward Jay, their jaws agape. Jay didn't move. He simply clasped his right fist as a wide spatial tear triggered around him, deleting the 3 lightning dragons in an instant as their energy being fed into the void of space. Not giving Susanu a moment to breathe, Jay slammed his palm into the ground. A surge of purple flame raced through the earth, turning the forest floor into a sea of violet incineration. Susanu, showing superhuman agility, launched himself into the air. He blinked through the sky and reappeared directly behind Jay's head, his hand shaped like a blade, aiming to pierce the boy's heart from behind. Again the strike passed through. But this time Jay was prepared. As Susanu's entire arm and torso moved through Jay's intangible form, Jay timed his return to tangibility with surgical precision. The moment Susanu's back was within reach, Jay's hand snapped out and gripped the god's bare shoulder. Incinerate. The purple flames didn't just burn, they hungrily consumed. A pillar of violet fire erupted from Jay's palm, engulfing Susanu's entire body. The divine lightning aura surrounding the god was instantly charred away, the purple heat bypassing his defenses and cooking his flesh. Susanu let out a guttural scream of genuine pain, a sound that shook the very foundations of the barrier. In a desperate surge of power, he blinked 50 meters away, his body smoking. The god landed heavily. His lightning aura had been snuffed out by the Incinerate Anthem purple flames. His skin was melted in several places, and his fine Shinto robes were shredded, revealing a ripped battle-scarred upper body. But as Jay watched, a crackle of blue lightning danced across Susanu's wounds. The skin knit back together, the charred flesh sloughing off to reveal fresh divine muscle beneath. The burn wounds that Incinerate Anthem inflicted is being healed instantly. Ha ha ha. Susanu laughed, his voice sounding slightly crazed. Now that is dangerous. Truly dangerous. That bastard god of the Bible really gave humans some terrifying toys to play with. Susanu stood tall, his eyes no longer just predatory, they were serious. The casual mockery had vanished, replaced by the respect one gives to a lethal opponent. Human, what is your name? Zayyn, Jay replied, his voice a flat, cold monotone. Zayyn, Susanu repeated, testing the name. I acknowledge you. You are no mere wielder of a stolen relic like the other bearers of Longinus. I, Susanu, acknowledge you as the strongest human I have ever had the pleasure of fighting. So rejoice. For that feat, I shall show you the greatness of my heavenly armaments. A spiritual pressure erupted from Susanu that made everything prior feel like a gentle breeze. The ground beneath his feet cracked as the gravity in the area intensified tenfold. Even outside the barrier, the shockwave of his presence was felt. Azazel attention turned towards the sudden pressure. Lavinia, who had been systematically freezing the reinforcements of the 5 principal clans, turned her head, her face pale. Ilyakuin, she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to rush to the barrier, but she knew that even with her absolute demise, entering that combat zone would be suicide. Unless she unleashed her balance breaker, she would only be a liability to him. Tobio, Samejima, and Natsum also paused, their eyes wide as they felt the earth-shaking aura. It was the weight of a world. In the center of the clearing, in the sky above, dark clouds began to swirl, casting deep, unnatural shadows over the inner sanctuary forest area. A bolt of thunder, white and pure, struck from the heavens directly into Susanu's right hand. As the light faded, a sword appeared. It was 10 palm lengths long, a Tatsuka no Tsurugi. The blade was slightly curved, forged of a pale silver steel that seemed to hold a perpetually drifting mist. Crackling lightning danced along the edge, and archaic Shinto runes etched into the metal glowed with the soft cold light of a full moon. The guard is simple and elegant, shaped like a stylized cloud ring, while the hilt is wrapped in white silk worn smooth. Then Susanu reached into the empty air with his left hand. And the moment Jay realized how dangerous the sword in Susanu's right hand was, he drew a second blade from thin air with his left. In his left hand, a sword manifests as a jet-black katana with a blade so thin it appears unreal, as if it were a void in space rather than solid steel. Along its edge runs a faint, fractured glow, like light struggling to escape a crack in reality. The blade's surface reflects nothing, not even light, while spatial distortions ripple subtly around it, warping the air like heat haze. The guard is angular and jagged, resembling a broken seal rather than a traditional tsuba, and the hilt is wrapped in deep crimson cord etched with ancient divine sigils meant to bind destruction itself. "Behold!" Susanu roared, holding both blades out. "2 of my 4 divine swords. Aim no Murakumo and aim no Habakiri." Hearing that, Jay grew wary. The term Tatsuka no Tsurugi literally translates to sword of 10 hand breadths or 10 palm lengths, a reference to the immense size of these blades. For those encountering Shinto mythology for the first time, it is easy to mistake the term as the name of a single, specific sword. That assumption would be incorrect. Tatsuka no Tsurugi is not an individual weapon, but a class of divine swords, wielded by multiple Shinto gods throughout myth. Among them, as Natsum had explained, 4 are regarded as the most powerful. And to think that 2 of them are in Susanu's hands right now. One is the cloud-gathering sword, Aim no Murakumo, a blade capable of summoning storms and thunder themselves in his right hand. Another is the blade most commonly known as the Snake Slayer, though some texts refer to it as the heaven-severing blade. In the epic, Susanu slew the legendary Yamato no Orochi with a single slash that originated from Takamagara, bypassing distance, space, and even dimensional boundaries. The strike did not merely cut flesh. It cleaved reality itself. Susanu grinned, his teeth white against his charred face. He raised the black blade in his left hand. "Let's see if your intangible body can dodge a slash that severs the heavens themselves." Susanu casually swung Aim no Habakiri. There was no travel time. There was no visible arc. Jay's domain of his own screamed a warning, but it was like a siren going off after the bomb had already hit. He felt the space around him being torn like a sheet of paper. "I can't dodge this using phantasmagoria." Jay's mind realized with a jolt of alarm. The blade wasn't hitting his physical body, it was cutting the space he occupied. Being intangible wouldn't save him if the space itself was being severed. Jay initiated a blind, desperate teleportation. Slash. Silence. Boom. The sound of the world being unmade echoed through the barrier. Jay reappeared 20 meters away, stumbling. He had moved in a microsecond, but he was still a fraction of a frame too late. Blood began to drip from Jay's left hand, staining the dark fabric of his hoodie. A jagged wound had opened along the side of his arm, the skin torn not by a metal edge, but by the spatial friction of the space-cutting slash. His left hand hung slightly limp, the nerves still reeling from the microsecond delay. Outside the barrier, Azazel gasped. The slash had been so powerful that it had carved a clean hole through his high-grade barrier, a feat that should have been almost impossible. "Ilya Lavinia cried out, her hands glowing with ice as she prepared to interfere, but the spatial pressure within the dome was now so erratic that even she couldn't find an opening to step in. Tobio looked concerned as well, but his attention snapped back when Uryu Nikiri's incoming attack came straight at him. "Don't turn your back, black dog." Meanwhile, inside the barrier, Jay ignored the blood. He ignored the stinging pain. He stood up straight as his breath coming in measured icy exhales. He looked at the black blade in Susanu's hand, then at his own bleeding arm. "A space-cutting slash," Jay muttered to himself, his mind already beginning to dissect the technique, even as his blood hit the dirt. "This is getting complicated." Susanu stood with absolute confidence, the black blade humming with the sound of 1,000 dying stars. The next one won't just graze you, Zayyn boy. I'm going to carve you out of this world. Chapter 36, Stormbringer. The inner sanctuary of the 5 principal clan estate had become a hellscape of clashing ideologies and elemental fury. While the purple flame of Jay's Incinerate Anthem clashed with Susanu heavenly dark blue storms within the barrier, the surrounding forest was a theater of high-speed supernatural warfare. Lavinia Rennie moved with the practiced grace of a master magician, her face a mask of cool concentration. Above her, the ice doll of absolute demise loomed like a spectral sentinel. Its 4 crystalline arms swung in massive, sweeping arcs as it trailing freezing mist that turned the humid air into falling snow. Suzaku Himejima met the frost with the roar of the vermilion bird. Her crimson flames lashed out in hungry whips, clashing against the ice in a hiss of steam that obscured the battlefield. Beside her, the Shinra heir, Byako, moved with a whitish aura of the white tiger, his claws extended, attempting to find a gap in Lavinia's defense. "Suzaku-san, please." Natsum Managawa shouted, her griffin diving to intercept a volley of explosive talismans launched by the Genbu heir. "You know this is wrong. We aren't your enemies." Suzaku's eyes were brimming with rejection, her face contorted in a grimace of spiritual agony. "I know, Natsum. But the blood, it burns. When the Forefather speaks, our bodies aren't our own. Move or I will burn you." "Then we'll just have to freeze that fire of yours," Lavinia said softly. With a flick of her wand, the ice doll's hands clapped together. A wave of absolute zero energy rippled outward. Sairyu Kushihashi, with bluish azure dragon's aura engulfing his body, slammed his palms into the dirt, conjuring massive wooden roots to shield his allies, but the wood shattered like glass the moment Lavinia's frost touched it. The disparity in magical depth was staggering. Lavinia wasn't just a magician, she was a wielder of a Longinus, and she was beginning to press the 4 heirs into a corner where even their sacred beasts could not protect them. Nearby, the earth groaned under the weight of the young Nikiri clan head. Uryu Nikiri was a golden juggernaut, his yellow dragon aura manifesting as a draconic mantle that pulverized everything it touched. "Is this the best the black dog can do?" Uryu roared, his voice amplified by divine mana. "To hide behind a fallen angel and a magician?" Tobio accused didn't answer with words. Jean, the shadow beast, had shifted. In its mouth, the creature gripped a manifestation of Aim no Ohabari, a black blade etched with red glowing Shinto runes. Each swing of the dog's head sent slashes of blackish-crimson flames carving through the golden dragon's scales. "Jean now!" Tobio commanded. Jean lunged, his form blurring into a shadow that bypassed Uryu's front guard. At the same time, Samejima stepped in from the flank, his sacred gear avatar Byakusa in the form of White Tiger lunged towards Uryu. "Don't forget about me, you cocky bastard." Samejima grunted, as Byakusa, unleashing its fang to pierce Uryu's body, forced him to cross his arms in defense. "Bastard!" Uryu grunted. The impact sent a tremor through the sanctuary. Natsum's griffin circled above, diving periodically to disrupt Uryu's vision with gusts of wind and feathers. The coordination was desperate but effective as the young Nikiri head was being pressed back, his pride wounded more than his body. Meanwhile, Azazel and Barakiel stood amidst a sea of unconscious elders. The senior members of the clans, despite their decades of experience, had been no match for 2 of the strongest entities in the Grigori. Barakiel moved like a ghost of violet-yellow lightning, his touch enough to short-circuit the nervous systems of the Shinto priests without a drop of blood being spilled. "Those 2 swords," Azazel muttered, now focused on maintaining the barrier from collapsing as his eyes locked on the shimmering barrier where Jay and Susanu were fighting. "Aim no Murakumo and aim no Habakiri." What an ominous aura. He looked at Jay's silhouette through the golden-violet film of the barrier. The boy stood with unwavering conviction, his hazel eyes not flinching even as the space around him vibrated with the threat of heavenly armaments. "Are you sure you can handle this, brat?" Azazel thought, a rare pang of anxiety tightening his chest. The young man who had been found dead somewhere in Romania just a few months ago was now standing on equal ground with one of Japan's strongest entities. A human on top of that too. Inside the barrier, the duel had reached a fever pitch. Jay had reactivated his domain of his own, but the space felt fragile. Every time Susanu swung aim no habakiri, the very fabric of space Jay used to teleport was being shredded into pieces like a thin papers. Jay flickered across the clearing, appearing and disappearing in microsecond intervals. Behind him, the air groaned as black slashes from the heaven-severing sword tore through his previous positions, leaving jagged scars in reality that took seconds to heal. Kuhahaha. What happened? Why are you only running? Susanu bellowed, his laughter echoing like thunder. Come on, Zayyn boy. Show me that arrogance from before. Jay remained silent. He was calculating. His domain was being torn to pieces and he couldn't maintain a stable spatial path to close the distance with Susanu for a physical strike. He was trapped in a defensive loop, blinking everywhere using Voidwalker just to stay in one piece. Susanu suddenly came to a halt. He planted his feet and charged his swing as he raised his left hand and the black blade of aim no habakiri glowing with a terrifying light-devouring aura. The darkness surged upward, erupting into the sky itself. The world shall bear witness, Susanu whispered, his voice suddenly cold. Tenkai Danzai heavenly judgment. Shuring. Time seemed to stutter as suddenly a massive, horizontal black slash erupted from the blade and expanding at a speed that bypassed the concept of velocity around Susanu. An area-wide severance as suddenly. Boom. The sound that followed was not an explosion, but the unmistakable crack of space itself breaking. Every tree, every stone, every blade of grass within the barrier was split with surgical precision, cleanly bifurcated as if reality had been drawn along a single, merciless line. Sensing the catastrophic overflow, Azazel forced every remaining drop of mana into the barrier, reinforcing it at the brink of collapse to prevent the slash from bleeding outward and erasing everyone within the inner sanctuary. Dust and spatial debris choked the air. From the outside, it looked as if everything inside the dome had been pulverized into a flat plane of nothingness. Trees were cut down like grass in a single clean sweep of aim no habakiri. Jay's figure vanished. Kuhahaha. Susanu laughed, still gripping both swords, before letting his left arm drop as he took in the devastation he had wrought, a wide grin spreading across his face. Even if you are the strongest human I have ever faced, you must understand this. Your kind cannot be compared to a god no matter how much power that pagan gods gave you. That is dash. His words were cut off, his eyes widening as he felt a ripple of mana stir behind him. From the ground directly behind Susanu, a figure rose like a ghost. Jay had not been caught in the slash. How? Susanu's mind raced. Did he use the split second I activated the strike to lower his space domain thing to knee level? He hid beneath the plane of the slash. Before Susanu could react, a tower of purple embers erupted from the ground and surged upward. The flames climbed like a living pillar, swallowing his legs in an instant. The pain was immediate and violent as the purple flame searing through divine flesh as the air itself warped from the heat. Susanu roared and forced his power downward, hurling himself into the air to break free. The burning column collapsed beneath him, scattering embers that faded before they could touch the ground. He steadied himself midair and hovering above the ruined forest. For a brief moment, silence followed. The god felt it then. Not pain, but humiliation. Aim no habakiri ultimate strike, a technique meant to erase battlefields and his enemies in a single strike had been rendered meaningless. It had not been raw strength that defied him, nor some divine artifact. Only timing, observation, and a single precise decision made in the smallest window of opportunity. The human standing before him was not strong through raw power alone. It was his prowess, his control, and his mastery over that power that made him truly dangerous and unbearably irritating. Realizing this, Susanu clenched his jaw. The thought burned deeper than the flames ever could. But as he deepened his thought, Jay was already behind him. Susanu felt it instantly. His instincts screamed as he twisted his body midair, thunder snarling along his limbs as he forced himself around with brute force alone. His face contorted into a feral grin, half rage and half pride, as his eyes locked onto the human hovering behind him. "Trying to catch me off guard?" he barked, storm clouds boiling around his form. "In your dreams." The air cracked as lightning flared, and the clash was inevitable. In his haste, Susanu swung aim no Murakumo with his right hand. The silver blade crackled with lightning and aimed to cleave Jay in two. But Jay didn't dodge. The blade passed right through him. Susanu's heart skipped a beat. In his fury, he had forgotten one fatal detail. Phantasmagoria's intangibility. Oh, Izana. Jay's hand reached out, hovering near Susanu's head. He's going to use that space rupture. Susanu's instincts screamed. He desperately tried to swing his left hand, which the one holding the heaven-severing sword. Susanu wrenched his body, forcing his left arm up, the heaven-severing sword screaming through the air in a desperate arc. But the motion was wrong. The angle was flawed. And worse, the strike was late. Even his divine speed could not overtake an action that had already begun. Jay's hazel eyes were calm as it stared to Susanu's soul. Empty of malice. Certain. His lips barely parted, the word escaping as a breath rather than a shout. Rupture. A jagged tear in space manifested exactly at Susanu's left elbow. Rag. The scream of agony that ripped from Susanu's throat was unlike anything the sanctuary had ever heard. It was the sound of a god realizing his own mortality. His left forearm, still clutching aim no habakiri, was severed. Jay didn't waste the opening. He snatched the falling severed hand out of the air, gripping the hilt of the black sword while the hand was still attached to it. He prepared to use rupture again to finish the storm god, but Susanu's survival instincts kicked in. A massive discharge of lightning from aim no Murakumo exploded from the god's body. Jay, realizing rupture was too slow to deploy against the discharge, pivoted and delivered a brutal magic-enhanced kick to Susanu's chest, launching him downward. Boom! Susanu hit the ground with the force of a starfall. As he struggled to find his breath, he looked up and saw Jay descending like an angel of death as his body flickered with purple flame, but before his figure disappeared. Purgatory, Jay whispered. The entire ground within the barrier erupted. It wasn't just small purple flame, it was a sea of violet incineration that burned instantly. Susanu screamed as the flames licked at his wounds. Suddenly, a massive shockwave of dark blue energy blew the flames back. A thick gray storm cloud enveloped Susanu as he forced himself to stand. You annoying bastard! Jay appeared again 70 meters away in a flicker of purple flame. He tore the severed already cold hand of the god from the hilt of aim no habakiri and cast the scrap of flesh aside like worthless junk. The black sword remained in his right hand, its dark edge humming faintly with power, while his gaze stayed cold and unwavering. Seeing that, the one-armed Susanu's blood boiled. You have gone too far, boy, he roared, divine fury shaking the air itself. You have crossed the final line and awakened my wrath. Jay ignored the screaming storm god. The moment his fingers closed around the hilt of aim no habakiri, a sensation of absolute serenity washed over him. It was the same feeling he had experienced when he first held Durandal. Almost as if the heaven-severing sword embraced him in its divine energy. Suddenly, Jay's internal mana circuits flared. His reserves didn't just refill, they expanded. He felt his capacity surge to 3 times its normal limit. His physical body felt reinforced, his senses sharpening until he could hear the heartbeat of everyone behind him. This is... Jay gripped the void-black blade, feeling the spatial distortions humming in harmony with his own magic. But there was no time for wonder. Susanu's aura had turned into something monstrous. A scary, dark blue energy laced with black lightning swirled around him, collapsing the very air. It has been hundreds of years since someone pushed me this far. Susanu roared. I will kill all of you. Every single one. Especially you. The sky over inner sanctuary responded. The barrier of that Azazel formed already weakened, shattered under the pressure of a country-scale storm. Dozens of lightning bolts struck the earth simultaneously, turning the sanctuary into a forest of white and blue light. Jay tried to attack Susanu's figure with a wave of purple flames, but the sheer destructive power of Susanu's current state simply pulverized the fire before it could reach him. Susanu began to transform. His skin turned a brilliant light blue, emitting a terrifying energy. An armor made of condensed storm clouds and dark divinity formed around his torso, and his eyes became 2 burning pits of blue lightning. He ascended into the sky, his presence so heavy that the battle between the clans and the Grigori stopped entirely. What the fuck? Azazel cursed, shielding his eyes. He's going into his true divine form. Are we going to die here? One of the elders whimpered as he fell to his knees, his voice trembling beneath the crushing pressure of divine power. Susanu's voice rolled down from the heavens, vast and merciless, as though the world itself had found words. Witness my wrath and be reduced to ashes by heavenly lightning. Perish, mortals. He raised his remaining arm, the cloud-gathering sword clenched tightly in his right hand. The sky answered his call. Dark clouds spiraled inward, collapsing into a massive vortex that swallowed the stars. Thunder howled like a living thing. From within the storm, two colossal forms emerged. A lightning Qilin stepped forth first, its body forged from crackling arcs of white and violet light, every movement sending thunder crashing across the sky. Beside it coiled a storm dragon, its serpentine form vast beyond measure, its scales formed from roiling storm clouds threaded with veins of living lightning. Together they eclipsed the moon, their immense silhouettes looming over the inner sanctuary like harbingers of annihilation, towering above everyone below as though all life were nothing more than ants beneath their gaze. "Oh shit," Azazel muttered, his hands moving frantically as the teleportation circle he formed to transport everyone from here only finished halfway. "We aren't going to make it." "Tenrariu," Susanu commanded, and the lightning beasts began their descent to erase the mountain from the map. But in the center of the destruction, Jay stood his ground. He held the black sword of the heavens in one hand and his own purple flames in the other. He closed his eyes, his mana resonating with the Longinus within him. The purple flame vanished. A whisper cut through the roar of the storm. "Balance breaker. True cross." Chapter 37, The Battle of Heaven and Earth. Moments before. The sky over the inner sanctuary was no longer a dark cloudy sky. As lightning Qilin stepped forth first, its body forged from crackling arcs of white and violet light, every movement sending thunder crashing across the sky. Lavinia looked upward and felt a shake in her soul. It was a living storm of divine wrath. Beside the lightning Qilin, a storm dragon coiled, its serpentine body stretching farther than the eye could follow, scales made of roiling clouds threaded with crackling lightning. The moon itself was swallowed by their enormity, she felt like she was an ant. Even the wind seemed to bow in submission as the immense creatures loomed, silent yet deafening, their presence a verdict on all that dared exist below. Members of the 5 principal clans, the very people who had lived their lives in service to these myths and gods of Shintoism, reacted with a chilling spectrum of despair. Some dropped to their knees, their weapons clattering onto the frozen earth as they wept in terror. Others, however, wore expressions of terrifying beatitude, almost a fanatical acceptance of their own annihilation. "Oh, to be returned to the heavens by the forefathers' own hand," one elder whispered, his eyes glazed with a suicidal joy. "That is some truly crazy shit," Lavinia muttered, her knuckles white as she gripped her staff. Beside her, Tobio's body was racked with tremors. Natsum, Samejima, and Sae had been forced to their knees by the sheer atmospheric pressure. The gravity within the sanctuary had spiked so high that the simple act of drawing breath felt like inhaling a water. Lavinia's gaze flicked to Azazel. The Governor-General was drenched in sweat, his 12 wings stretched wide over the teenagers as he frantically channeling mana into a massive, shimmering teleportation circle. Yet even he looked grim. The divine strike descended faster than the circle could form. Realizing Azazel wouldn't complete the teleportation in time, Lavinia's frosted mana erupted around her, shimmering like shards of ice in a storm. Desperation sharpened her resolve as she would unleash her final resort. Her eyes narrowed, hard as tempered steel. Asalido Argdesh. Before the incantation for her own balance breaker could leave her lips, a silence fell. It was not the absence of sound, but a sudden heavy vacuum that swallowed the roar of the storm. A whisper, cold as the void yet strangely warm like an old memory, rippled through the clearing. "Balance breaker." From beneath Jay's feet, a flicker of black flame erupted. It wasn't the violent flickering purple of the Anthem. It was a deep absolute darkness that seemed to drink the very light of the lightning above. "True cross." The black flared. Shying. The colossal lightning beast struck. The Qilin's horn and the dragon's maw descended like twin pillars of celestial judgment, aimed to erase everything within a mile radius. But the moment the blue-white thunder touched the rising black embers, a deafening crack echoed across the realms. The earth shook with such violence that trees miles away were uprooted. A flash of blinding blue light struggled against a rising tide of blazing darkness. For a microsecond, the two forces reached a stalemate, and then, as if defying every law of magical thermodynamics, the black flame began to consume the lightning. The divine beasts didn't just explode, they were burned into nothingness. A blinding light illuminated the world. The massive spiritual constructs were reduced to cinders of light that drifted harmlessly to the ground like glowing snow. As the lightning strike was annihilated, silence fell over the inner sanctuary. Everyone struggled to process what had just happened, as somehow their destruction had not truly happened. Tobio stared, his jaw slack. What is that? Suzaku, who had fallen to her knees in resignation, reached out a hand. A stray black ember drifted past her before settling in her palm before vanishing without a trace. She didn't feel the bite of heat, but rather a lingering ancient warmth. That flame, what is that flame? Lavinia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her cold expression melted into a soft, relieved smile as she looked at Jay's back. His left arm was a mess, it grazed, bleeding, and torn from elbow to wrist. But he stood there unfazed, holding a black sword in his right hand. You saved us again. Illya-kun, she thought. The silence that followed was so profound it felt loud. Azazel, standing amidst his half-finished teleportation circle, suddenly broke into a low, incredulous laugh. He stared at the aura radiating from Jay. It was a presence so familiar it made his skin crawl. Are you fucking kidding me? Azazel laughed as he thought, a sound of pure, defeated amusement. He hasn't even used his balance breaker until now? All that spatial tearing, that purple incineration, that was him holding back. From sheer destructive force alone, Jay's Incinerate Anthem and mastery of spatial magic placed him firmly in the ultimate class. Yet it wasn't just raw power. Combined with his wits and unorthodox fighting style, he could easily take down a mid-tier or even a borderline high-tier ultimate class opponent. And now, Azazel had no idea anymore. Barakiel stepped up beside Azazel, his own lightning flickering weakly in the presence of Jay's darkness. That is the Holy Spirit. No, that's not it. It's similar, but this is something that predates the word. It's the righteousness of holiness mixed with a malicious primordial evil. Something in between. Susanu stood frozen in the sky, his one remaining hand trembling. His ultimate attack, a technique that could have easily destroyed a whole region, had been reduced to ash by some inexplicable power. A black flame so absurd that it defied logic, a flame capable of consuming his divine lightning. What the hell is that, he thought. Hovering above them all, Susanu's gaze then swept the crowd before ending at Jay's figure, and then, unexpectedly, he opened his mouth. You were still hiding a trump card? Kuhahaha. Susanu's laughter was jagged, lacking its previous mirth. As his light blue eyes met Jay's deep dark hazel gaze, the god felt a shiver of genuine dread. For a moment he didn't see a human boy. He saw a ghost of a time before the Shinto gods had even walked the islands. Jay exhaled, a plume of gray mist escaping his lips. He felt the weight of Aim no Habakiri in his hand. With his mana reserves tripled by the sword's divine grace, the strain of the true cross no longer threatened to drain his life force completely. Realizing the battle that is going down, Azazel conjured a shimmering protective barrier once more as the air crackling and a giant magic circle materialized the vast defensive barrier around him. As Jay turned to face him, Azazel simply smirked in defeat, and Jay raised his left hand and raised his thumbs up with deliberate calm. Fucking monster, the fallen angel murmured, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. So this is why you cherish them, father. Now I understand the meaning of your human potential. Meanwhile, Jay turned his gaze back to the sky. Susanu's left arm began knitting itself together in a crackle of lightning, and from the severed limb, a thunderous hand materialized brimming with raw divine power. Susanu did not hesitate. With a roar that shook the clouds, he summoned 1,000 lightning spears like a torrential storm of gold and blue descending toward Jay. Yet Jay did not flinch. The black flames of the passive judgment field erupted around him like a tornado of blazing flame, reducing every spear to gray soot before they could reach his shadow. In the next instant, Susanu appeared mere feet from Jay. The god of storms in his true divinity mode moved with blinding speed as his hands aimed for Jay's head. Jay's phantasmagoria flickered, allowing Susanu to pass through him as if he were nothing but air. But Jay did not merely defend. As Susanu's physical body slid past him, Jay snapped back into tangibility and swung the heaven-severing sword with precise lethal intent. But time seemed to hesitate. Susanu, with his reflexes honed over eons, twisted midair and spinning 180 degrees. His silver blade, Aim no Murakumo, clashed against the black steel of Jay's sword with a metallic roar. Clang! The shockwave rippled outward, cracking the ground and sending sparks dancing through the storm-laden air. Neither of them wavered, yet in that instant, the sheer force of their collision left the battlefield trembling. The sound bypassed the ears and vibrated in the marrow of everyone present. No matter how much Jay's body had been enhanced by the divine properties of Aim no Habakiri, his mortal form could never hope to match Susanu in true divinity. At the height of his power, Susanu moved with a speed approaching that of light, a blur of godly energy that made even the fastest mortal reaction seem painfully slow. Susanu unleashed hundreds of slashes in the span of a second, creating a thundering roar of friction. But Jay's physicality, reinforced by the divine sword and balance breaker, allowed him to sense the ripples of mana from the attack before they manifested. Black flames erupted with every clash, the judgment field eating away at Susanu's divine lightning. Jay realized that teleportation was becoming redundant. Susanu moved faster than neurons could fire. Susanu blinked behind Jay once more, his immense form materializing in an instant. Lightning coiled around his arm and concentrated into a single lethal point at his fingertip. The air itself seemed to scream under its intensity. "Perish!" the god of storms thundered. Jay did not flinch. He shifted his weight subtly and deliberately, letting Susanu's strike pass through his intangible chest once more. And before Susanu could pull back and strike again, Jay manipulated the space around him with surgical precision. Rupture bloomed in the exact spot Susanu now occupied, warping reality and threatening to tear the god from existence. Susanu's eyes widened just in time, and with a blink of flash he narrowly escaped, moving only inches from where the void would have severed his body. But Jay already turned his body as he swung the black sword. "Too slow," Jay muttered to himself. But with the heaven-severing sword in his hand, the very concept of distance was an illusion. Susanu saw it and seized the opening. He's going to swing, he realized. In that single split second when Jay would have to become tangible, Susanu answered with instinct and cruelty. Lightning answered his call, a thunder strike tearing down from the heavens above. Black fire flared along Jay's blade as he whispered, "Cleave." Boom. The thunder crashed into him as the swing completed. Jay triggered Phantasmagoria a heartbeat too late. The strike still caught his back, scorching through cloth and flesh alike. Pain ripped through him, forcing a sharp grimace, but the motion of the blade never faltered. Shirring. Susanu widened his eyes. He leaned to the side as his body blurring with divine speed just before Jay finished his swing, but he wasn't fast enough. The slash of Aim no Habakiri, just as he familiar with, doesn't care about distance. Its slash instantly appeared in his side. Splurt. A black slash cut through the space beside him, severing the god's newly regenerated fingers. Before the fingers could even hit the ground, they were caught in the black flames and vanished. Susanu retreated 50 feet away in the air in a blink of flash, his chest heaving. He looked down at his hand and tried to channel his energy to regenerate it, but to his shock it would not heal. The black flame had left charred, inky marks burned into the wound. It won't heal," Susanu whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of storm and lightning. For the first time in millennia, the god of storms felt the cold, biting grip of fear. Every instinct honed over Ian screamed at him that something was wrong. He had assumed he could win through attrition, that the human's energy would falter over time if he can just drag this fight long enough. But now he feel like those black flames. "What is that flame? Who gave you that power?" Susanu screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. Jay, his breathing heavy as pain screamed through his back, paused. He looked down at his hands, then at the black sword resting within his grip. After a moment he gave a small, genuine shrug. "I don't know." "What? Are you fuck dash?" Before Susanu could finish his words, Jay's energy suddenly erupted. A dark aura surged outward, sending shivers to everyone, even to the elders of the clans who were still conscious. In Susanu's eyes the scenery began to distort. The ruined forest of the inner sanctuary vanished, replaced by a desolate, infinite land of darkness. The sky turned a bruised black, torn apart by a single bleeding red streak. And behind Jay, a towering ancient wooden cross rose, wreathed in black flames so immense it pierced the heavens. "What is this illusion?" Susanu gasped. Meanwhile, to everyone else, nothing seemed to have changed. It was only that Jay now radiated an aura that was both ominous and sacred, a dark glow that pressed against the edges of perception. Around him, the battlefield had fallen silent. The fight between the Grigori and the 5 principal clans had ended, the latter unable to continue. Tobio stared in disbelief. This aura, is this Zayyn-san's balance breaker? Not quite, Azazel replied calmly. It is a subspecies balance breaker. A subspecies balance breaker? Tobio repeated, incredulous. This time it was Lavinia who answered. A subspecies balance breaker manifests differently from the original. It takes on a form that reflects its wielder, gaining new abilities based on their desires. Because of this, subspecies balance breakers are considered even more powerful than the standard version. Desires, Tobio echoed, a trace of wonder in his voice. Lavinia's gaze shifted to Jay's back, her expression layered and conflicted, tinged with empathy. To manifest a power like this, she thought, something must have been lost. A loss so profound that it shaped his desires to brought forth this extraordinary power. As Susanu felt as if he were standing before his father, instinct screamed at him to open a portal to Takamagara. You can't kill me, Susanu roared. You will feel the wrath of my sisters. Amaterasu won't spare a single human soul if you do this. Jay paused for a moment, sensing the shift. Susanu had opened a gate, tearing the space before him with a crackle of lightning. But with a sudden black flash, the portal was ripped apart, split in two, and obliterated in an instant. Fuck! Susanu cursed. Losing aim no Habakiri was the single deadliest mistake he had made in this battle. A dark, suicidal resolve took hold of him. If this is where it ends, then let the heavens bear witness. I shall call the seas to rise and wash this land back into nothingness. As Susanu's thunderous aura flared, he condensed it into a single blinding ball of light. The small sphere radiated such immense energy that Jay could feel the raw potential to annihilate everything around them. Trying to drown his own people. God my ass, Jay thought. The walls of the inner sanctuary groaned long before Susanu moved, and space itself strained as though it were a flawed container trying to hold a god. The air thickened, wind coiling inward instead of outward, every breath drawn toward the bluish-dark sphere, as if reality itself were being inhaled. There was no storm to summon, no horizon to rend apart as he had turned the world itself inside out. And it all happened in an instant. Seeing that, Azazel, having just completed his teleportation circle, grimaced. He's trying to drown this entire place, no, this entire country in a flood of tsunami. At his words, everyone's faces turned pale and tense, the weight of the threat settling over them like a shadow. As pressure mounted, sound vanished, and space began collapsing inward, folding layer by layer as divine wind ground matter, light, and even intent into nothingness. Every particle trembled as if creation itself was being rewritten. And as the god of storms, words echo through the sanctuary. A burst of thunderous tsunami erupted from the balls. Shinmet dash. But before he could finish, Jay's aim no Habakiri flared simultaneously, wreathed in black flames, the heaven-severing sword descent. As a whisper. Cleave. Shying. The world split. A blazing line of black fire carved straight through the fabric of reality, and the heart of the condensed sphere. The thunderous tsunami collapsed instantly, its divine mass flash-boiled into a roaring explosion of steam that vanished before it could touch the ground. What remained was not water or lightning, but absence. And then the slash continued. Space itself parted as the world-cutting slash passed through Susanu's divine form, cleaving him cleanly through the center. My attack. Susanu murmured, eyes wide in disbelief. His final resort. The culmination of storm, sea, and lightning. How ironic that the ultimate strike of the fastest god Shintoism, the embodiment of lightning itself, reduced to nothing but evaporating mist, not because it was overwhelmed. It was outpaced. As the line of blazing black fire crossed his body, Susanu felt something he had not known in millennia. Warmth. Ancient and quiet. A flame that did not rage but judged. For a fraction of a heartbeat, shorter than thought itself, he understood. Then the heat came. A fire far hotter than his sister's heavenly flame. Divinity burned to nothing. In a soundless flash, his divine body dissolved into pure light, scattering across the sanctuary like dying stars before being swallowed by the black flames. The storm fell silent. The god of storms ceased to be. Chapter 38, Godslayer. The silence that followed the death of God of Storms was not peaceful. It was a heavy silence. The air humid of Susanu's attack being evaporated by the black flame. The barriers that had once defined the combat zone were gone, shattered by the final catastrophic collision of divine annihilation and all-burning flame. What had once been a luxurious ancient mansion inside the inner sanctuary, a symbol of the 5 principal clans' millennia of prestige, was now a scorched, jagged giant crater. The battlefield was full of destruction, patches of ground frozen into permafrost by Lavinia's magic lay adjacent to earth turned into molten glass by Jay's purple embers. Ancient trees inside the inner sanctuary that had stood for centuries were now nothing but splintered toothpicks. In the center of this devastation, Jay stood alone. He watched the last of Susanu's essence dissolve into the air like dying embers of light. From the sky, the silver blade of Aim no Murakumo began to fall, its owner no longer having hands to hold it. With a sluggish flick of his fingers, Jay used a ripple of spatial magic to snatch the sword from the air, storing it away in his pocket dimension. And with Aim no Murakumo, the cloud-gathering sword in his pocket dimension, and the heaven-severing sword of Aim no Habakiri in his hand, he now possessed 2 of the 4 divine swords of Japan. He had stripped the Shinto pantheon of its greatest armaments. As the adrenaline began to drain from his system, the reality of his condition came crashing down. A genuine agonizing heat and pain bloomed across his back. He tried to use Aim no Habakiri as a cane to keep himself upright, but his knees betrayed him. The world tilted. Jay collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he coughed blood onto the scorched grounds. He hadn't meant to activate the avatar manifestation of the true cross, at least not consciously. In that final moment, he had simply reached for every scrap of power his soul could offer, and the Longinus had responded by manifesting a piece of the primordial execution. The strain of hosting such a manifestation, even for minutes, had pushed his mortal shell to the brink of collapse. Behind him, the survivors of the 5 principal clans were paralyzed. To see a god die was a theological impossibility made manifest. Their eyes, from the elders to the heirs such as Suzakas, Byakos, even the proud Uryus, were fixed on Jay's scarred, smoking back. Their expressions were of a pure unadulterated hatred, but also a bone-deep primal fear. After all, he was a godslayer. The word was whispered by an elder, a low trembling voice that carried through the silence like a death knell. Illya Kovalenko. Lavinia was the first to reach him. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, her hands glowing with a faint bluish-green light. "Don't move. Let me heal you." As she moved to his side, her breath hitched. Jay's left hand was a gruesome sight, grazed and torn as if it had been put through a serrated grinder, exposing the raw pulsing muscle beneath. But as her gaze moved to his back, her face turned pale. The strike from Susanu's divine lightning had hit him directly. The wound had cauterized instantly, but it had left behind a branching dendritic Lichtenberg figure. A lightning-shaped scar where the skin had been fused by heat that should have vaporized a normal human. The flesh around the scar was scorched black, and blood seeped from the edges of the jagged mark. "Oh no. Wait a minute." Lavinia's voice was trembling. She channeled a faint bluish-green glow into his arm first. Slowly, the muscles began to knit together as the skin closed, leaving behind a jagged line of scar tissue that stretched from his shoulder to his wrist. Jay looked at her, his hazel eyes clouded with fatigue. "Thank you, Lavi." "Shh, don't speak. Don't move your body," she scolded gently, though her eyes were brimming with tears. Azazel, Barakiel, and the teenagers approached slowly. Natsum had to look away, covering her mouth with her hand. Samejima stood silent, his usual bravado completely extinguished. Even Jean, the shadow dog, had reverted to a small, shivering puppy, whining at Jay's side. "This is..." Azazel peered at the scar on Jay's back, his expression turning sour. "Governor General, why is that wounds, how do you say it, different?" Tobio asked, his voice cracking. Azazel sighed, crossing his arms. "That wounds, the physical damage can be healed, but that mark. A human body is not designed to endure divine energy embedded into it, so it usually cannot regenerate back to its original form, even with a strong healing magic. But aside from its appearance, there shouldn't be any problems." Lavinia bit her lip, pressing her hands against the scorch marks on Jay's back. Jay let out a jagged breath. "Is it still hurts?" she asked. "It's much better, thanks," Jay rasped. But suddenly, a ripple of magic caught everyone's attention, including Jay, who turned toward its source. He felt it immediately, like his domain itself, the fabric of space, was being burned. Then 2 figures appeared in the sky. The first figure is a very beautiful mature woman with long white hair brushed with faint traces of gold, flowing freely down her back. Her eyes are a steady amber, calm and unwavering as he looked down everyone on the ground with divine judgment. Her skin carries a soft natural radiance. She wears layered white and crimson robes styled after a sacred Miko, adorned with restrained solar motifs, while a polished mirror etched with ancient markings hovers quietly behind her like a ceremonial halo. Her presence is orderly and dignified, neither imposing nor gentle, as if light itself stands in human form. Beside her stood a man in quiet contrast. He was slender and tall, cloaked in robes the color of an inkwash painting that seemed to swallow the light. His eyes were silver and distant, holding the silence of a winter moon. The 5 principal clan members dropped to their knees instantly. Amaterasu Amikami. Tsukuyumi no Mikoto. Azazel whispered. Well, this just became a family reunion. Amaterasu's amber eyes landed on Jay. Her voice was calm, yet there is some maliciousness behind it. Human child. Do you understand the consequences of your actions? Without warning, she flicked a finger. A ball of white-hot solar fire erupted in the air, hurtling toward Jay. Lavinia didn't hesitate. She threw her staff forward, a massive blizzard of ice erupting to meet the flame. The ice melted into steam almost instantly, but the momentum of the attack was halted as her ice froze the white ball of fire. Oh Lord, this is getting complicated, Azazel whispered, but this was exactly why he was the best diplomat heaven had ever known, self-proclaimed. He stepped forward, putting himself between the gods and everyone. Now, Amaterasu-chan. It's been so long. You're looking as radiant as Dash. A lash of white flame scorched the earth at Azazel, but he shielded it easily. Shut up, Azazel, Amaterasu said coldly. I have no interest in your chatter. She turned her gaze back to Jay. You killed my brother. Reckless and noisy as he is still my brother. But he is gone now. Dead. Do you have anything to say to me before I erase you from existence? Jay struggled to his feet. Lavinia tried to hold him back, but he gently pushed her hand away, using his sheer will to stand tall. He looked up at the sun goddess with eyes that didn't waver. No, Jay said. One word. Flat and unapologetic. Amaterasu's eyes flared. The mirror behind her began to glow with a blinding intensity. Then perish. A dragon made of white solar fire roared into existence, diving toward the group. Jay's hand snapped out, and a wave of concentrated purple flame erupted, meeting the white fire head-on. The 2 holy fires of 2 different origins, one of Shintoism and another of the Bible faction, clashed with a violent screeching sound. The ground beneath them began to liquefy from the heat. Azazel and Lavinia worked in tandem, one providing a barrier and the other a cooling mist, just to keep the bystanders from being cooked alive by the radiance. The man beside Amaterasu, Tsukuyumi, simply raised a hand as a barrier of dark energy protecting his sister from the backlash. As the heat waves reduced suddenly. Governor? The coordinates were a mess, a voice shouted from behind. A teleportation portal ripped open, and 5 powerful figures stepped through. Shemhazai, Penemu, Sahariel, Tamiel, and Armoros. The cadre, some of the highest-ranking fallen angels of Grigori, had arrived. What? Wait, don't tell me you are calling us to fight Shinto Fantians? Tamiel, the blonde fallen, yelped. Penemu promptly punched him in the shoulder. Shut up, Tamiel, she hissed, though her eyes remained fixed on the gods above. Azazel turned back to Amaterasu, his playful tone replaced by something sharper. Well, Amaterasu-chan, let's look at the board. You want to risk the extinction of your faction by starting a war with the Grigori? We have 3 Longinus users here, one of whom just killed your brother, as you probably know. Or let's settle this through negotiation and talk. You know me, we can discuss it one by one just like the old days if you want. Azazel said. Negotiation? Are you taking me for a joke, Azazel? Amaterasu's finger pointed directly at Jay. How about this? You hand over that human child and your faction stays out of war. Are you really willing to let your people die just for a single human? Azazel couldn't answer. Handing Jay over would have been the logical choice. After all, the boy had nothing to do with him. They had only just met. And yet, as a self-proclaimed genius, Azazel saw something else. He was investing in potential. He couldn't even remember the last time a human had killed a god. It must have been thousands of years ago. The young man standing before him would shape the future of humanity, and perhaps the entire supernatural world as well. But Jay broke the silence as he stepped forward. Your brother, Jay's voice echoing through the crater, died because of his greed. He tried to kill a human boy for a sword. In his rage, he tried to drown this entire island. He not only betrayed his own people, but he also betrayed you. Amaterasu's eyes widened. Nonsense. She raised her hand, and a massive magic circle appeared in the sky as a mini-sun, a meteor made of pure divine flame began to descend. Jay didn't look at Azazel for help. He raised aim no Habakiri. The black blade flared with an intense black flame. With a casual swing, Jay sent a slash of blazing black flame upward. The black flames entered the core of the white meteor, and everyone watched in shock as the divine meteor was simply annihilated. It didn't explode, it was consumed by the black flame. My divine flame? Amaterasu thought, her composure finally cracking. That flame, Tsukuyomi spoke for the first time, his voice a calm silver bell. It has anti-divinity properties. It was a bad matchup for Susanu from the start. And for us as well, sister. How can a human possess such power? Amaterasu whispered. I don't know, Tsukuyomi replied, looking at Jay with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. But Azazel is right. We cannot afford a war right now. Not with the Fallens, and certainly not with a boy who carries such power. Not when our faction is not even united enough to survive such a clash. Are you implying I should waver because of some crows and a boy with a god's toy? Amaterasu shot him a sharp glance. I am implying that now is not the right time to move, Tsukuyomi said firmly. Amaterasu tensed, her amber eyes locked with Jay's hazel ones for a long, silent minute. Finally, she let out a sharp tsk. A portal of fire opened behind her. She turned, her crimson robes fluttering, and vanished into the light. Tsukuyomi lingered for a moment, his silver eyes resting on the black flame still dancing on Jay's sword. Anomaly. The moon god murmured before following his sister. As the divine pressure vanished, the entire group exhaled simultaneously. Tamil slumped. We almost fought against God. Barakiel looked at Azazel. I thought Amaterasu and Susanu had a strained relationship. Why would she come here to avenge him? She is not avenging him, Azazel said, watching the spot where they had vanished. She was embarrassed. A major Shinto god was killed by a human. If she didn't show up to make a scene, it would look like the Shinto faction had lost their spine. I believe it was a political theater, well, at least some of it. Azazel knew Amaterasu well. She was never particularly fond of Susanu, but if he were in her position, he would have taken the same stance. For beings like them, it was ultimately a matter of honor and pride. Barakiel looked at Jay. A godslayer, huh? I've forgotten when the last time a human truly earned that title. Jay, who had been holding himself upright through sheer determination, finally felt the world fade to black. He slipped aim no Habakiri into his pocket dimension just before his eyes closed and his body began to tip forward. Lavinia caught him before he hit the dirt, pulling his head into her chest. Is he okay? Tobio asked, rushing over with Jean. He's fine, Lavinia said, her hand resting on Jay's forehead. Manner exhaustion. Physical trauma. He just needs to rest. Lavinia smiled as he looked at Jay unconscious in her embrace. It's finally over. Chapter 39, Hero. The 5 principal clans had suffered losses that would take generations to repair. The inner sanctuary, the spiritual and physical heart of their ancestral pride, was no longer a sprawling estate of trees, it was a cratered wasteland. While the supernatural world began to vibrate with the news of a fallen god, Jay was far removed from the politics. As Jay finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was a dark wooden roof illuminated by the glistening morning light. Every muscle in his body felt stiff, as if he had been turned to stone and only recently reclaimed his flesh. Since when did I come home? His memories were a blurred montage of Amaterasu's amber eyes, the scorching heat of white flames, and the eventual retreat of the Shinto gods. After that, there was only a vast darkness as he fell unconscious. He realized he wasn't wearing a shirt. Bandages were wrapped tightly around his torso, smelling faintly of fresh linen and Lavinia's cooling magic, but there is another smell of iris on top of that. And as he tried to shift, he felt a weight beside him. A soft rhythmic breathing and the undeniable sensation of warm skin pressed against his side. To his surprise, sleeping soundly beside him was Lavinia. She wore a revealing, almost translucent black nightgown that did little to hide the voluptuous curves of her body. Her blonde hair was a messy halo across the pillow, and her arm was draped over his Hans. Jay felt a sudden surge of hormones. He was, after all, a boy in the middle of puberty, and having a beautiful young woman just 2 or 3 years older pressed against him in a bed was a situation his biology wasn't prepared to ignore. Ah shit, calm down. He closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe. He was a master of control. He had learned to regulate his mana flow under the threat of death and manipulate the very fabric of space. Controlling a bit of teenage lust should have been a piece of cake. Yeah, no. It is not that easy. But Jay able to manage it. Feeling Jay's movement, Lavinia stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open slowly, her blue eyes misty with sleep. "You've awaked already?" she murmured in a sleepy, almost inaudible tone. "Good morning, Lavi," Jay said softly, deciding it was best for his mind to completely ignore why she was in his bed. "Moaning," Lavinia answered with a wide yawn, stretching like a cat. Growing up in the orphanage, Jay had often slept in cramped quarters shared with other children, both boys and girls. To him, the act of sharing a bed wasn't inherently sexual, it was a lingering habit of seeking warmth and safety. He didn't mind her presence, even if the safety part was currently being challenged by her choice of sleepwear. "You need more rest, Illya Kovalenko," she said, her voice regaining its clarity. "Yeah, I guess so. Is it still hurts? You're back." Her fingers reached out, tracing the edge of the bandages near his ribs. "Thanks to you, it's manageable." Hearing that, a small, knowing smirk played on Lavinia's lips. "Thanks to you, we all still lived." Jay's eyes began to drift around the room, searching the nightstand and the dresser. Lavinia tilted her head, watching his gaze. "What are you looking for?" "My watch." Lavinia remembered. She sat up, the thin straps of her gown slipping slightly as she reached for the desk. "Is this the one?" Jay nodded as she handed it to him. He took it with a reverence. "Yeah. Thank you." Lavinia pouted slightly, her curiosity getting the better of her. "That is one expensive watch. Did someone important give it to you?" Jay clicked the strap around his wrist before opened his wardrobe and pulling on a clean shirt. "Yeah, it's like a lucky charm." He answered. "Glenda gave it to me actually," Jay said. Lavinia's eyes widened and a warm knowing smile spread across her face. As Jay stood up to head for the door, Lavinia's expression turned pensive. "Can I?" Jay paused, hand on the doorknob. "Never mind," she shook her head, looking at her lap. Jay looked at her for a moment, reading the hesitation in her shoulders. He realized what she wanted to ask. "You want to meet her? Glenda?" Lavinia's eyes brightened with a sudden, fragile hope. She nodded slowly. "Then let's meet her later after all of this is done," Jay promised. "Yes, thank you, Illya Kovalenko." Lavinia smiled. The morning proceeded with a domestic peace that felt surreal given the carnage of the previous week. Jay took over the kitchen, cooking a simple chicken soup. The same recipe Sister Andrea and Elena used to make at the orphanage whenever they had a bit of spare money to spend on some meat. Lavinia insisted on helping, though she mostly spent the time watching him with an amused expression. Between sips of soup, Lavinia updated him on the aftermath. "Only 2 deceased from the 5 principal clans," she explained. And ironically, both were killed by Susanu's own stray lightning. And since it's not mainly Grigori nor Grauzauberer fault that the inner sanctuary even destroyed, it seems like they didn't pursue it further. Jay assumed they were simply afraid after witnessing that display, unwilling to push things any further. Before, they had acted recklessly, lacking any real understanding of just how powerful the Grigori and the 3 Longinus wielders truly were. Now that ignorance was gone. With that realization came hesitation, and with hesitation came restraint. For the first time, violence was no longer their immediate answer. And because of that, Azazel's task of settling the matter through diplomacy had become far easier than it ever would have been before. Though Jay still need to be careful with Amaterasu. It doesn't seem like she will let him go just like that after killing her brother. In the afternoon they moved to the veranda. The air was cool, the scent of rain lingering in the distance. Jay sat with a cup of black tea and some biscuits Lavinia had baked during the afternoon. On the table before him lay the spoils of war. On the left was Aim no Murakumo. The cloud-gathering sword was slightly curved, forged of a pale silver steel that seemed to hold a perpetually drifting mist within its reflection. Archaic Shinto runes etched into the metal glowed with a soft, cold light reminiscent of a full moon. On the right was Aim no Habakiri. The heaven-severing sword was a jet-black katana with a blade so thin it seemed to disappear when viewed from certain angles. It reflected absolutely nothing. Its guard was angular and jagged, the hilt wrapped in a deep crimson cord etched with ancient divine sigils. Those two swords, Lavinia whispered, leaning in to look at them. Yeah. They were Susanu's. Well, they're mine now, Jay said. He ran a finger along the hilt of Habakiri. He found its weight perfect. Its divine property, which is the ability to bypass space and time for an instantaneous hit, was a literal cheat code, and it fits with the way he fight. That's one absurdly broken ability, Jay thought, but the counter is simple. Just be faster than my swing. Susanu was exactly that. He was fast, too fast. So fast that the only times the blade could truly reach him were in moments of surprise, or in that single fatal instant when he took just a fraction too long while activating his final attack. And it fuses with the black flame, he noted. The Blackfire mode, as he mentally dubbed it, was a terrifying combination. It was the same combination he used to cleave Susanu in the final moments. Well, that was true if he ignored the other benefits. Simply wielding the sword sent his physical capabilities through the roof, pushing him far beyond normal human limits. Even his mana reserves were somehow tripled, which, depending on how one looked at it, might have been the greater gain of all. Lavinia beside her meanwhile focused her attention to the silver blade. Those runes, they're different from any other Shinto runes that I've known, Lavinia said as she inspected the faintly glowing markings etched into Murakumo's silver blade. Yeah, if I remember correctly, Jay replied. Susanu found the blade inside Yamato no Orochi's tail. And since Orochi itself is something far older than him, it's probably tied to a primordial naturally occurring calamity. Something closer to the concept of storms itself. That's why the runes aren't technically Shinto in origin, nor derived from it. The silver sword was something else entirely as Jay closed his fingers around its hilt. There was no physical enchantment to it like Habakiri, he feels no reinforcement of the body, no enhancement to mana reserves. Yet the difference between wielding Habakiri and Murakumo was unmistakable. While Habakiri was a composed, indifferent partner, Murakumo felt like a wild horse. There was turbulence within the steel. A chaotic energy that pushed back against his will, restless and untamed, as if the blade itself refused to be mastered. It was going to take time to control this beast. He thought. He sighed and stored both weapons back into his pocket dimension. Whoa, the biscuits are already gone. Lavinia laughed, noticing the empty plate. I'm going to get more. She headed back toward the kitchen, but just as she crossed the threshold, the front bell rang. HM? A visitor? That's rare. She thought. Lavinia, still holding a plate of freshly baked biscuits, walked toward the front door. Wait. She paused for a fraction of a second, then opened it. Two men stood outside. The first was a young man with short black hair and piercing blue eyes. He wore an unusual blend of attire. A Japanese gakurin neatly fitted to his frame, yet over it hung elements of ancient Chinese hanfu, the fabric tied casually at his waist, combining tradition and modernity. The second was also young with black hair and spectacles. A mage-style robe draped over his uniform, the same gakurin that the first man wore, and a feathered cape rested on his shoulders. Who? The first man mused, eyes gleaming with amusement. So the Godslayer and the Ice Princess of Grauzauberer lived together. Now this is what I call killing two birds with one stone. At the mention of those titles, Lavinia's faint smile vanished. Her gaze sharpened as she assessed the two figures before her. They are both human without a doubt. And yet, the pressure they exuded was unmistakable. Dense. Refined. Dangerous. A Longinus wielder. She realized. Before she could speak, footsteps echoed behind her. Jay emerged from the hallway, dressed casually in baggy gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt, completely at odds with the tension gathering at the doorstep. Who is it, Lavi? He hadn't activated his domain, so he hadn't sensed them beforehand. Maybe leaving it off all the time wasn't such a great idea after all. Jay's eyes shifted to the two men as he came to stand beside Lavinia. Is there something you need? He asked calmly. The handsome man in front stepped forward slightly, smiling as though meeting an old friend. It's an honor to finally meet the Godslayer, he said. My name is Cao Cao, descendant of the great Cao Cao, Cao Mingda, as recorded in the records of the Three Kingdoms. As he spoke, golden light flared in his hand. A spear materialized, ornate and unmistakably powerful. Its dark blue shaft was longer than that of ordinary spears, wrapped in spiraling golden decorations shaped like arrowheads, twisting upward in a double helix pattern. Near the top, the design culminated in a hollow white circle, partially filled by a cross that never quite completed itself. Beneath it rested a small silver stump with 4 protrusions, 2 on each side like restrained wings. The spear's tip was silver, elongated and lethal. And we are from the hero faction. Jay and Lavinia exchanged a glance. Hero? Jay repeated, eyebrow twitching. Chapter 40, True Longinus. Hero? Jay asked. Now that he had seen it, that spear was radiating such an immense holy aura. And since there was only one spear he knew of, wielded by a human, that could possibly emanate such an aura, there was no doubt. He thought he knew what it was. Yes, we are. But Jay simply turned his back. Yeah, hold on. Let's go inside, Jay said casually. He reached over, took the plate of biscuits from Lavinia's hand, and walked back into the house without a second glance at the 2 visitors. Lavinia stood speechless for a moment, her mouth slightly agape. She looked at Jay's retreating figure, then back at the 2 visitors. She sighed before her gaze fixed Cao Cao and the man behind him with a sharp gaze. You can come, and don't forget to close the door, Lavinia said, following Jay and leaving Cao Cao and the other man staring at each other in confusion. You sure, Cao Cao? It's probably a trap, the man whispered. I don't sense any trap, but I'm not certain either. Be ready to teleport with Dimension Lost in case we're ambushed, George, Cao Cao replied. George nodded. The 2 of them stepped inside the mansion cautiously and closed the door behind them. The interior was mostly wooden, but it wasn't traditional Japanese architecture. Modern yet warm with natural wooden tones giving it a lived-in elegant feel. Inside they saw Jay and Lavinia already seated side by side on the couch in the living room. Without hesitation, they took their seats across from them, eyes scanning the room while trying not to reveal their tension. Here are some biscuits Lavi made, Jay said, gesturing to the table as the 2 guests sat down across from him. Try them. They're good. Cao Cao and George exchanged a long, bewildered look. Cao Cao still held the true Longinus, the spear's tip resting near his boot. He studied Jay's face, looking for a twitch, a smirk, or a sign of mockery. Deciding to regain control of the room, Cao Cao put on his most charismatic smile. We actually have something important to discuss with you. But first, let me introduce ourselves properly. My name is Cao Cao, the descendant of the hero of the 3 kingdoms. And this is George, the descendant of Johann George Faust. At the mention of Faust, Lavinia's eyebrows shot up. The descendant of the founding father of Grauzauber? Why haven't I seen you in there? I never joined them, George answered shortly. Cao Cao cleared his throat, clearly irritated at being sidelined by small talk. Anyway, as you can see, I am the wielder of the true Longinus. The strongest of the 13 Longinus. The spear that... You prefer tea or coffee? Jay interrupted, his expression entirely deadpan. A vein popped in Cao Cao's forehead. The charismatic mask slipped for a fraction of a second after being treated like a door-to-door salesman. I'm joking, Jay said, though his voice remained flat. Cao Cao forced a dry cough and smoothed his expression. Right. Moving on. Have the 2 of you heard of the hero faction? Not that I remember, Lavinia said. She looked at Jay, who simply shook his head. We are the hero faction. Humans who refuse to accept the idea that the world should belong to gods, devils, or dragons simply because they were born divine. Those evil beings are a cancer upon this world. Wherever they exist, humans suffer. And so we believe that they must be fought and defeated. Hearing that, Jay thought quietly. So an organization like that really exists, huh? And for that purpose, Cao Cao continued, we gather humans with sacred gears, humans with magical potential. We fight those beings to create a better world, one without the oppression of gods, devils, and dragons. The world for human. His gaze settled fully on Jay. And so, he said calmly, I am honored to ask the man who has already achieved something even I, the strongest human, have not. A brief pause. To kill a god. Cao Cao's lips curved into a thin smile as he extended his hands to Jay. Join the hero faction, Godslayer. The room fell into a heavy silence when Jay's expression didn't change at all in response to Chow Chow's invitation. For Longinus users sitting at the same table was already a miracle. That such a meeting hadn't yet spiraled into disaster felt like another. George studied the man across from him. The Scorch Magician, that was the name one of his informants had used. In truth, the report had been sparse. All it confirmed was that this young man wielded Incinerate Anthem. Yet as a fellow magician, George could sense something far more unsettling. The magical imprint emanating from Jay felt ordinary, almost non-existent. If George had encountered him on the street, he would have dismissed him as just another mundane human without a second glance. And that was precisely the problem. This was a young man who had killed a god. News of that feat had spread widely throughout the supernatural world. There was only one conclusion George could draw: Jay's control over mana was so refined that it left no excess leakage, no presence to be felt. A true master magician. And that led to one deeply troubling realization. Jay had not killed Susanu through brute force alone. After some time, "I must admit that you have one noble goals," Jay said, finally speaking. Then but the so-called evil beings you talking about, gods, devils, vampires, they all also shared one trait. They believed they had the right to stand above others. His eyes lifted, finally meeting Chow Chow's. With a brief pause, Jay then said, "And so do all of you." Chow Chow's smile faded the moment the words left Jay's mouth. Jay didn't press him. He spoke evenly, almost detached, as if stating an obvious fact. "Evil isn't born from fangs, halos, or divinity," he said. "It's born the instant someone decides their power gives them the right to stand above others." He gestured vaguely around the room. "Gods call it providence. Devils call it hierarchy. Vampires call it lineage. And you call it being a hero." His gaze hardened. "I don't care about your noble cause. After all, I am not a good person." Jay simply said. Even if there was kindness within evil, even if not all devils were oppressors, it didn't matter. What kept him moving wasn't justice, or salvation, or the protection of humanity. It was the creed he had carved into himself and chosen to follow. If that creed made him evil, then so be it. This was never a path of righteousness. It simply is. Hearing such rejection, Chow Chow smiled. "I see, then that's too bad." Suddenly the air screamed. Chow Chow moved with a speed that bypassed human perception, the tip of the true Longinus thrusting directly toward Jay's face. Crack! Before the spear could travel 6 inches, a massive pillar of ice erupted from the floor, encasing the blade in a frozen tomb. Lavinia stood up, her face a mask of frost and a faint whitish hue emanating from her skin. Chow Chow didn't look at her. He didn't have to. A blinding, holy light exploded from the spear, shattering the glacier into a million shards of glittering dust. The tip of the spear was now just an inch from Jay's nose. But Chow Chow stopped. "Now that's more like it," Chow Chow muttered with a grin. And the reason Chow Chow stopped was because a jet-black katana was already resting at his neck, threatening to cut it at any moment. George, who also specialized in spatial magic, widened his eyes in shock. He hadn't even realized that the blade had already been mere millimeters from Chow Chow's throat. The jet-black sword radiated an aura so intense that somehow dimension lost, the Longinus he wielded seemed to scream in fear. "What is that blade?" George thought. Chow Chow slowly withdrew his spear, and Jay stepped back in tandem. The two measured each other silently before Chow Chow's gaze shifted to Lavinia. "What about you, Ice Princess? Interested in joining?" Chow Chow asked, his charming smile in place. "No, thank you," Lavinia hissed, her frost-tipped hair trembling slightly with restrained power. "Very well. A shame our recruitment process failed, but it is what it is," Chow Chow said. A thick purple fog suddenly enveloped both him and George uses the signature ability of the 4th strongest Longinus, Dimension Lost. "Then we shall meet again, Godslayer, Ice Princess. Perhaps next time on the battlefield," Chow Chow added, his confident smile cutting through the haze. As the mist began to swallow them, Jay made a sudden slight movement. Shirring. A flash of black light tore through the purple fog. "Ugh!" Chow Chow's head snapped back. A thin red line appeared on his cheek, blood trickling down his jaw. His eyes widened in genuine shock. The attack had been so fast that it felt nearly instantaneous, a spatial bypass that ignored the distance between them. Next time, Jay said, sitting back down and reaching for a biscuit, don't bring a spear to a conversation. The purple fog vanished, taking Chow Chow and George with it. And then their figures disappeared entirely. Jay returned Habakiri to his pocket dimension, his expression calm as he sank back into the couch. Lavinia's gaze lingered on the spot where the two had vanished, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and unease in her eyes. Hero faction. I should probably reported it to Chief Leader, she murmured. Jay leaned back, thinking. The strongest human, huh? 3 days later, Jay and Lavinia arrived at the Grigori headquarters, navigating the sleek, high-tech hallways of Nephilim. The Shinto pantheon is breathing down my neck, Azazel muttered, rubbing his temples. Amaterasu is demanding both of Susanu's swords be returned immediately. No, Jay replied simply. Azazel let out a long, weary sigh. Yeah, I figured you'd say that. Since I don't have any excuse for that matter, you'd better be ready to face her because the one they're really coming after is you. Jay just ignored Azazel. Lavinia looked around the bustling facility. Where are Natsum, Toby, and the others? Officially enrolled here at Nephilim, Azazel explained. They need to train their sacred gears properly, especially the survivors from the Utsasimi's agency. They were soon met by Penemu, the purple-haired cadre of the fallen angels. She offered a rare, sharp smile. Sup, Penemu. Good afternoon, Governor. She then looked at Lavinia and Jay, especially Jay. You two look better. By the way, I heard the three of you talking about the kids. It is the perfect time since Tobio and Valley are sparring in the training pit right now. Jay's heart skipped a beat. Valley? The name echoed in his mind, stirring memories of cold nights and a shared past. They followed Penemu to an observation window overlooking a massive combat floor below. Down in the arena, two figures were moving in a blur of motion. One was Tobio with Jean on his side, while the other was a handsome boy with light silver hair and a fierce, unmistakable look in his eyes. He was shorter than Jay remembered, or perhaps Jay had simply grown more these last few months. But it's unmistakably him, the only one left that night. A friend. Valley. Jay whispered, his voice barely audible. Chapter 41, Past and Future. Valley. Jay's voice was soft, but something shifted in his expression. He looked at the boy with a complicated gaze. And without realizing it, a rare faint smile surfaced. He had never blamed Valley for what happened that night. Not once. In Jay's eyes, Valley was no less a victim than Sister Andrea or the children. That night had been beyond his control. No matter that he bore one of the 13 original Longinus, he was still powerless before Berjekwel. Still just a child, no different from the others. No different from himself. Valley had even been willing to throw his life away so that him and everyone else could live. To condemn him after that would have been unfair. Half devil, half human, but more than anything else he was a victim of this cruel world. Lavinia, who rarely see those expression in Jay's eyes, pointed out. Illya Kovalenko? Lavinia asked, tilted her head. Is there something that caught your eyes? Ah, so Zayyn Kovalenko haven't told you, princess? Azazel said with a smirk. Jay threw a glance to him, asking him to shut his mouth. But trying to get his lick on Jay, Azazel opened his mouth. Zayyn Kovalenko actually knew Valley. They are both of very, very good friends. Right. A jagged tear in the space opened up on Azazel's head, but he can dodge it with a smile on his face. Azazel, though, a cold sweat appeared on his forehead despite the smile. I know he didn't actually intended to kill me, but isn't it overboard for a friendly banter? Azazel thought. Whoa, my bad. I didn't know that it's supposed to be a secret that only I and him should have known. Azazel said. You are friends with Vakuin? Lavinia asked. In which Jay just silenced before he shook his head. It's a long story. And also, don't take any of his words seriously. Jay said, staring at Azazel, in which the latter just smiled at him. While Penemu shook her head. And then they are looking at Tobio going at it with Valley, in which the latter seems like he taking it easy. Tobio charged first, shadows surging around him as Jean lunged forward in a snapping arc. Jean moved fast in a flash of black, but Valley met the assault with almost casual precision. With just a single step and a slight tilt of his body, and the shadow claws tore through empty air. Come on, Tobio. Is that all the slash dog can do? Valley taunted with a grin, his silver hair barely fluttering as he stood with his hands in his pockets. Tobio gritted his teeth. That's not all, Valley. In a flash of black, Tobio and Jean moved in perfect synchronization. Tobio lunged forward, a scythe of shadow manifesting in his hands, while Jean circled around to Vala's blind spot. The shadow scythe whistled through the air, aimed at Vala's shoulder, while the wolf's claws tore upward from the ground. Vala didn't move until the blades were inches from his skin. With a predatory grace that looked almost like teleportation, he stepped into the gap between the two attacks. He caught Tobio's wrist with his left hand and used the momentum to swing the teenager directly into the path of his own shadow wolf. Boom! Tobio barely managed to disperse Jean back into his shadow to avoid a collision. He tumbled across the cratered floor but recovered instantly. He then launched a burst of black and red flame from the sword in Jin's mouth. Vala simply swiped his hand through the air. A shockwave of blue mana swept the fire like dust. Too slow. Not yet. Tobio roared. He slammed his palms onto the floor. The arena floor turned into a sea of ink. Dozens of black blades erupted simultaneously in a cage of thorns, converging on the silver-haired boy from every angle. It was an upgraded version of his Haken. That he had been trained since he felt the powerlessness of fighting against God. Never again I would let someone protecting me and everyone that I love. Tobio thought about the figure of Jay fighting against Susanu, before his mind drifted towards Valley. Now that's better, Valley murmured. Suddenly, two ethereal, translucent blue wings made of light erupted from Vala's back. A voice deep and resonant like a tolling bell echoed through the chamber. Divide. The massive pressure of the dozens of blades made of darkness didn't just stop, it withered. The mana powering the shadows was halved, then halved again in a heartbeat, until the blade became nothing more than harmless wisps of smoke. Valley moved like a streak of blue light, appearing directly in front of Tobio. Before Tobio could even raise his guard, Vala's palm was resting against his chest. Game over, Valley said. A gentle pulse of energy sent Tobio sliding back across the floor, his shadows retreating into his feet. He was gasping for air, his mana reserves drained to the dregs. While Jean also barked, feeling exhausted. You've got the power, Tobio, Valley said, the wings of light vanishing as he dropped back to a casual stance. But your body is the bottleneck. In the base form of your sacred gear, you're too prone to direct attacks. If I were a real enemy, your head would have been off before you finished your first incantation. Train your physical form as much as your shadows. Tobio took a deep breath, wiping sweat from his brow. He bowed slightly, a look of genuine respect on his face. I see. I still have a long way to go. Thank you, Valley. Valley just nodded, his expression bored, as he turned to walk out of the training ground. But as he moved, he suddenly froze. He tilted his head back, his sharp eyes narrowing as they flicked toward the observation glass. And there he see Azazel, Penemu and Lavinia which finally come back. Something wrong, Valley? Tobio asked, noticing the subtle shift in the silver-haired boy's posture. He followed Vala's line of sight and spotted Lavinia beyond the observation glass, waving cheerfully at them. Lavinia's back already, then Zayyn too, Tobio thought. He glanced back at Valley, a faint chill running down his spine. If battle maniac like Valley knew about Zayyn's fight with Susanu, Tobio couldn't even imagine the noise Valley would make trying to challenge him. He thought with a tired smile. Valley didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the glass, expression unreadable. For a brief moment, it was as if something deep within him stirred, a sense of familiarity he couldn't quite grasp. Then he finally spoke, his voice measured but hesitant. No. It's nothing. Meanwhile, Azazel cast a brief glance at Jay, who had already stepped back. He had completely masked his magical imprint, something he was exceptionally good at. Lavinia then turned her head toward Azazel. Governor General, actually there is another reason I came here, Lavinia said, meeting his gaze. I'm planning to take a holiday from both my duties in Grauzauberer and Grigori. So I just wanted to inform you in case the chief leader hasn't told you yet. Azazel looked at Jay, then back at Lavinia, a smirk forming on his face. Oh? What's this, a honeymoon? Yes. Lavinia answered brightly, smiling without hesitation. Jay remained silent, offering no comment. Well then, Azazel said, chuckling, as a wise leader I grant both of you a pass. He raised his thumb in approval. Let's meet everyone and say our goodbyes, Lavinia said. I'll wait here, Lavi. You three go ahead, Jay replied. Lavinia fell silent for a moment. She didn't know the full nature of Jay's relationship with Valley, but it was clearly something complicated. Something that she decided not to pry unless Jay is willing to tell her. "Okay," she said softly. Lavinia and Penemu walked away together, with Azazel following shortly after. Before leaving, however, Azazel stopped and looked back at Jay. "You sure you don't want to see him? If he finds out you knew he was alive and still chose to avoid him, he's going to be furious," Azazel warned. "No," Jay answered quietly. "I am going to kill his father and every single one that share the blood of the devils. I won't drag him into that path of blood. He deserved to live a long, fulfilling life. This is my path and mine alone." Azazel paused, contemplating Jay's words. He wanted to say, "What about you?" but stopped as he thought that questions weren't his to press. When he had first heard Jay speak of his goal, he had dismissed it as bravado, even a bad joke. After watching him face a god head-on, that doesn't seem like it. "You know that path is like walking barefoot through hell," Azazel said, his voice heavy with genuine sympathy. "Annihilating an entire race is genocide. It leads only to more suffering and pointless sorrow. Trust me, I know that better than most." Jay did not waver. "I see," Azazel sighed. "Then who am I to stop you? But a wise leader I am. I actually do believe that if there is a devil who truly deserves to die, it's going to be that man." Jay looked up. "It's the same man Valley blames for your family's slaughter. His name is Rizavim Levon Lucifer, the son of the original Lucifer." Jay silently carved the name into his memory. Rizavim Levon Lucifer. "Good luck with that, brat," Azazel said, patting Jay on the shoulder before walking off to follow Lavinia and Penemu. Jay was left alone, standing in the quiet hallway. After bidding their farewells to the group, Jay and Lavinia returned to the mansion. The air between them was light, yet filled with a quiet anticipation. Lavinia moved through the rooms with a humming energy, packing a small leather satchel with essentials. For her, this honeymoon, as Azazel so crudely put it, was a journey of closure. "I'm ready, Illya Kovalenko," she said, reaching for his hand. Jay nodded. He focused his mind, reaching out to the specific spatial coordinates he had etched into his mind. With a flicker of purple flame, the air around them folded. When the world settled, the natural woody Kyoto breeze was replaced by the overwhelming nostalgic aroma of old parchment, dried herbs, and bitter ink. They were standing in the center of a vast circular library. Towering shelves carved from dark enchanted wood spiraled upward into a ceiling as if it never ends. Jay exhaled, a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying finally snapping. It had only been a month, but coming back to the Emerald City felt like returning to the only home he had left. He could feel the familiar weight of the air, which is Glenda's unique spatial magic imprint that used to make this library in the first place. Beside him, Lavinia stood frozen. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch the spine of a nearby shelves. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away. "This place," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's full of her. I can feel her everywhere." This was the sanctuary of the woman who had raised her, the mentor who had taught her the intricacies of magic. Her mother figure. "She's here, isn't she?" Lavinia asked, her eyes searching the shadows of the stacks. Jay frowned, his brow furrowing as he expanded his domain. He searched for that specific, sharp spark of the Witch of the South. He searched the battle chambers, the personal quarters, and even the kitchen where the smell of tea usually lingered. I can't feel her presence," Jay said. A frantic search followed. They hurried through the winding halls of the basement house, their footsteps echoing through the silence. The library was empty. The training rooms were cold. Her personal room was perfectly made, the bedsheets smooth, as if she had simply stepped out for a moment. "Maybe she's in the lab?" Lavinia suggested, her hope beginning to fray at the edges. They reached the laboratory. It was a room filled with bubbling retorts, some parchments full of magic circle design, and stacks of disorganized notes. Jay scanned the workspace. Everything was laid out with Glenda's characteristic, obsessive perfection. "She must be working on something elsewhere," Jay muttered, trying to reassure Lavinia. "Everything here is prepped for a long project." Lavinia slumped into a chair, her shoulders drooping with a heavy, sudden disappointment. She had prepared herself for a confrontation, for a hug, for a lecture. Anything but this echoing silence. She looked around the cluttered desk, her fingers mindlessly brushing over a bunch of stacked books before stopped at a thick, leather-bound volume of book. Soul magic? She murmured, noticing the title. She pulled the book closer. It was a dense treatise on the manipulation of the human essence and the stabilization of independent avatar-type sacred gears. As she flipped through the pages, her mind drifted to the words of Augusta. But as she moved the book, a small piece of parchment fluttered out from between the pages. "Jay, look," Lavinia said, her voice turning sharp. Jay walked over, taking the paper from her. It was a letter. The ink was fresh, the handwriting hurried and jagged. It contained only a single sentence. To Verona. The Sephiroth Graal has manifested in the land of vampires. War is coming. Seeing the word vampire, Jay's gaze went cold. He had already planned to visit them, and it seemed it would come sooner than he had expected. Chapter 42, Transylvania. The air inside the Orthodox Church in the Suceava region was heavy with incense and old sanctity. Towering stone pillars rose toward a domed ceiling painted with fading icons of saints and angels, their gazes solemn and unyielding. Rows of candles illuminated the vast interior. Despite its religious appearance, this was not merely a place of worship. The Orthodox Church of Suceava was one of the largest exorcist bases in Romania. Hidden beneath the sacred architecture were armories, training halls, command chambers, and sealed vaults where cursed artifacts were stored under constant holy suppression. Exorcists from across Eastern Europe rotated through this place, especially its location that is close to the vampire world. Tonight, however, only one man occupied the training ground across the church. David Serro stood at the center of the open space, sword in hand, his breathing steady as the last traces of holy energy faded from the blade. Sweat clung to his brow, and the faint glow of consecrated magic slowly dispersed into the air around him. He lowered his weapon and exhaled. "Tch sloppy." David Serro sat on the edge, staring blankly at the stone floor of the training hall. He was a man in his mid-30s, an Italian exorcist with dark brown hair slicked back with sweat, his face framed by a rugged, unkempt beard and mustache that spoke of a week spent in restless recovery. He adjusted the white patient robes he wore, his fingers tracing the thick bandages wrapped around his torso and arms. It had been 7 days since the mission that brought him to this place in the first place. He slowly flexed his right hand, then winced. Bandages wrapped his palm and forearm, still faintly stained with dried blood. A week had passed since the mission to investigate one of the vampire base in Transylvania. A mission that he considered to be a failure. Tch. David clicked his tongue and sat up, running his left hand through his slicked-back dark brown hair. His beard had grown unevenly during recovery, giving him a more rugged, hardened look than usual. But the reason why he pissed is not because he failed to kill some of those filthy creatures. He closed his eyes and the memories surfaced whether he wanted them to or not. Blood-soaked stone in a forest near the countryside of Transylvania region. Vampires collapsing under his blade, their bodies reduced to ash by holy fire. He remembered the thrill, the clarity. He had killed dozens that night, including the boy. What's that girl called him? Gasper, David muttered under his breath. A damper, barely more than a child. Weak. Hesitant. Unworthy of mercy. David remembered how the holy sword had pierced through his hearth. And yet, his jaw tightened. The real prize had slipped through his fingers. The girl herself. The blonde girl who was with that boy, Gasper. He could still see it clearly. The golden chalice cradled in her hands, glowing like a fragment of heaven itself. The moment he saw it, his blood had run cold. A sacred gear. No. The Holy Grail, David whispered. The Sephiroth Graal. The cup of blood. He could still see the radiance of that golden chalice reflecting in her terrified eyes. The Sephiroth Graal. The cup of blood. It was one of the 13 Longinus that said to capable of rewriting the laws of life and death. David's grip tightened on his bandaged hand until the stitches pulled. If he had secured that artifact, his name would have been etched into history alongside legends like Vasco Estrada. He would have been the hero the church needed. Instead, the girl had vanished into the mist, whisked away by Teep's reinforcements while he was buried under a tide of screeching bats and feral fangs. He had barely made it back to the base, dragging his broken body through the Romanian wilderness. The present moment pulled him back as the evening sun dipped below the Carpathian peaks, casting long jagged shadows across the training ground. It was nearly midnight. David stood up, his muscles protesting with every movement. He needed to clear his head. He didn't like this place. He found the orthodox traditions stifling and the local exorcists too set in their ways, but it was a necessary waypoint as he needed a place to rest and heal his wound before his return to the Vatican. As David crossed the small creek that separated the outer grounds from the inner compound, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. Too quiet. Usually, the midnight vigils would be marked by the low hum of chanting or the rhythmic footsteps of sentries. Tonight there was nothing. He stopped at the gate and scanned the area. Torches still burned along the paths, their flames steady, untouched by wind. Everything looked normal. And that was the problem. "TCH, get a grip," he muttered to himself. "You're imagining things." David's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of the sword at his waist. He walked down a narrow stone alleyway leading toward the residential wing, his eyes darting between the archways. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing hollowly against the cold walls. There was no verbal answer, only a sudden shift in the darkness. David lunged forward, swinging his blade in a wide arc at a presence he felt rather than saw, but the steel met only thin air. "Show yourself," he yelled. The silhouette he had targeted vanished as if it were made of smoke. Before he could reset his stance, the shadows beneath his feet boiled. A hand made of solidified darkness erupted from the ground, lashing around his waist and pinning his arms to his sides with crushing force. "Who are you? Show yourselves!" David screamed, struggling against the grip of the darkness. Figures began to step out from the lightless corners of the alley. They were pale, their eyes glowing with a predatory crimson light that pierced the gloom. They wore elegant, high-collared black coats that billowed around them like the wings of giant bats. Dozens of them materialized, blocking both ends of the alleyway. "Vampires!" David shouted. He forced his hand free just enough to manifest a sphere of concentrated holy light. "Burn, you filth!" He launched the ball of magic directly at the lead vampire's chest. It was a spell designed to vaporize creatures of the darkness like them on contact. The light hit the vampire squarely, illuminating the alley in a brilliant white flash. David waited for the screams of agony, for the smell of scorching flesh. But as the light faded, the vampire stood perfectly still. His coat unmarred, a bored expression on his face. He brushed a stray speck of dust from his sleeve. David's heart plummeted. How? Vampires were creatures of darkness. Holy magic should have been a death sentence to them. Yet the scene before him betrayed that belief. One of the vampires stepped forward, his boots clicking on the cobblestones. "What do you want?" David snarled, fear finally beginning to seep through his bravado. "You are in the heart of an exorcist base. You think you can walk out of here alive? There are hundreds of us." The lead vampire let out a soft melodic laugh that sent chills down David's spine. He gestured to the shadows behind him. Two other vampires stepped forward, carrying a heavy burlap sack. With a casual flick of their wrists, they emptied the contents at David's feet. David's breath hitched. Round objects thudded and rolled across the stone. He stared down into the lifeless, wide-eyed faces of the base commanders and the priest he had shared a meal with this last few days. The heads were jaggedly severed, the stone beneath them quickly turning dark with cooling blood. "This place has been thou roughly cleaned," the vampire said. You slaughtered everyone?" David stammered. If his words were true. He thought the scale of the massacre was unfathomable. Hundreds of trained warriors, dead in a single silent night without a single alarm being raised. The church. Heaven itself will not be silent. You called destruction upon yourself. The vampire didn't seem to care. He tilted his head, watching David's trembling knees with the curiosity of a child looking at an insect. "You want to kill me then? Do it!" David shouted, his voice cracking. "Oh no," the vampire replied in a playful tone. "That is not for us to decide." Before David could react, two spears of solidified darkness shot out from the ground, piercing through his feet and anchoring him to the earth. He let out a strangled cry of agony, falling to his knees as the shadows climbed up his legs like freezing vines. The lead vampire leaned in close, his cold breath smelling of ancient dust and iron. "The Teeps send their regards." And darkness engulfed David's vision. That night, the silence that fell over the Suceava region would be recorded in human history as a mysterious tragedy known as the slaughter of Suceava. But to the supernatural world it was just the beginning. After spending a couple days meticulously searching every corner of the Emerald City to ensure Glenda truly wasn't going to return anytime soon, Zayyn Illya decided to go to Romania. The letter was their only lead. With the familiar coordinate of his home country and superb spatial magic, the two of them emerged in the heart of Bucharest with just a flicker of purple ember. Cold autumn air greeted them instantly. Coming back to Romania was a jarring collision of emotions. The biting wind carried a chilling, familiar scent that felt both like a agonizing and homecoming. Jay adjusted his long black coat, his fingers brushing against the silk of his burgundy tie. He looked out at the gray skyline, his mind drifting to the names he carried like anchors. I should visit them later. Sister Andrea, Elena, Mihia, Andrei, Iacob, Eli, Philip. He thought. The names lingered in his mind longer than he expected. He had survived, but the guilt of his survival remained. Jay and Lavinia then found a quiet restaurant in the city center to gather their bearings. Seated side by side at a small table overlooking the bustling, fog-thickened roads of Bucharest, they ordered a traditional spread of mezaluri, some sort of cured meat, an egg, cheese, and some veggies. Jay picked at the cured meats and cheeses, sipping a steaming cup of black tea to ward off the autumnal chill that had firmly set in. Lavinia sat beside him, looking elegant in a dark brown cashmere coat and a black turtleneck, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she studied a map of the Transylvania region. Where exactly is this vampire world? Jay asked, his voice low enough to be drowned out by the clatter of silverware. I grew up here, but I never saw these kind of civilization. They live inside the cracks of the human world, Lavinia explained, her gaze shifting to the busy street. They inhabit the darkness. Through powerful bounded fields magic, creating a pocket dimensions. Both the Teeps and Carmilla factions have carved out territories that overlap with our own but remain invisible to the normal human eye. I don't know exactly either, but I've heard from Asha that they usually live in the mountains or forests. That's the war the latter talking about between those two. She leaned in closer, her expression turning academic. The split happened several hundred years ago. It was a schism over blood purity. One side believed a male true ancestor should lead to retain their lineage, while the other insisted on a female true ancestor. This birthed the Teeps faction, which is the male-dominated side, and the Carmilla faction, which is female-led. They've maintained a cold, hateful status quo for centuries. And the balance tipped, Jay noted. Because of the Grawl, Lavinia whispered. A Longinus appearing within their territory would tip the balance instantly. Since sacred gears are typically born from humans, the wielder is likely a damper or a half-vampire. They are often treated as outcasts or slaves by purebloods, but a damper with the Sephiroth Grawl, they would become the most valuable pawn to them. It was an assumption, but a logical one. The letter hadn't specified who held the cup, only that it had manifested. But a war, that could only mean several things. As they finished their meal, Jay stepped up to the counter to pay. A stack of morning newspapers caught his eye, the headlines printed in bold, jagged Romanian script. He felt a prickle of unease and bought a copy. As he opened it, his eyebrows shot up. Lavinia leaned over his shoulder, her breath hitching. No, that can't be. The headline bold. The slaughter of Suceava. The report was grim. Last night, an Orthodox church used as a community center had been the site of an inexplicable massacre. Around 500 people, clergy and civilians alike, had been found dead. To the human public, it was a senseless act of mass murder. To Jay and Lavinia, the timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. They shared a silent nod and left the restaurant. In a blur of spatial displacement, they vanished from the alleyway and reappeared on the outskirts of Suceava. It was a scene. Police tape cordoned off the scorched stone of the church, and a massive crowd of mourners and onlookers pressed against the barricades. Jay and Lavinia stood at the back of the throng, their eyes scanning the structure. Jay was already calculating the coordinates to slip past the police and teleported inside. But before he could activate his power, a cheery melodic voice cut through the sound of the weeping crowd. Yo? Isn't that you, Ilya-san? I didn't think you'd be assigned to this task too. Wow, you've grown so fast. You're actually taller than me now. Jay froze. He turned his head slowly to the side, his expression flattening into a mask of indifference. Lavinia turned as well, her eyes widening at the rare sound of someone using Jay's middle name. Two people stood there. One was a striking woman in her late 20s with piercing blue eyes and an air of calm authority. Beside her stood a handsome young man with messy blonde hair and vibrant green eyes, wearing the distinct, high-collared attire of a high-ranking church exorcist. He was smiling as if he had just run into an old friend at a cafe, rather than at the sight of a mass grave. "You don't remember? We met in Verona. I'm Illya." Recognition flickered in Jay's eyes. He remembered him. But Jay felt a phantom itch of irritation. He didn't like this man. Chapter 43 Skirmish. Jay stood face to face with the blonde exorcist, his expression remaining an unreadable mask. He hadn't realized how much he had changed until this moment. He was taller than even Lavinia right now. He wondered whether it was simply a natural growth spurt, or if being bound to the divine properties of Aim no Habakiri had accelerated his physical development, the same force that had boosted his physical capabilities to a superhuman level. "Ah, and the lady is?" Illya asked, his green eyes shifting to Lavinia with polite curiosity. "Lavia," she answered simply, offering a slight nod. Jay studied Illya and the woman beside him. He had initially assumed they would recognize him and Lavinia immediately, but the world of the supernatural was vast. Illya was likely active almost entirely within the Vatican's direct sphere of influence in Italy, while Grauzauberer operated mainly in Germany and remained highly secretive about their activities. Unless Lavinia had unleashed the frost of absolute demise in public, it was unlikely that Illya would have known of her existence. Still, Jay did not care much about his identity being recognized. People knew what they knew, and that was all there was to it. "And this is Sister Griselda," Illya continued, gesturing to the blue-eyed woman. "My mentor." "Nice to meet you," Jay said. He stepped forward and shook her hand. It was a brief, professional contact, but in that split second Jay silently planted a microscopic strand of his mana onto her glove. A trace so faint and refined that even a master magician like Lavinia wouldn't have noticed it. "He feels like he is going to need it later." Griselda nodded back, her gaze sharp and clinical, as if she were trying to peel back the layers of Jay's identity. "What do you think about this mission, Illya-san?" Illya asked, leaning back slightly with his hands in his pockets. "Mission? Is this guy serious?" Jay thought. It seemed Illya still believed Jay was an operative of the church, likely based on their first encounter in Verona. Beside him, Lavinia looked visibly confused, while Griselda's eyes narrowed, staring at Illya as if he had finally lost his mind. Jay decided to play along. If the church was mobilizing, he wanted to know the scale of it. "I don't know," Jay said, his voice even. "But a tragedy of this scale, with 500 dead and not a single survivor to tell the tale. Don't you think there is something weird about that?" "That's the mystery," Illya admitted, his cheerful demeanor dimming for a moment. "Especially since several of the victims were high-ranking individuals who shouldn't have been taken down so easily even by the likes of them." "By the way," Jay asked, prying deeper, "how many of us will be involved in the retaliation?" "I think around—" Illya stopped abruptly as Griselda let out a sharp, pointed cough. "Mr. Gesualdo, I believe we are expected elsewhere," Griselda said, her voice like cracking ice. Illya blinked, realizing he had been a second away from disclosing mission specifics to two people who hadn't officially checked in. He rubbed the back of his head, looking sheepish. "Right. Sorry about that. Well then, Illya-san, Lavia-san. Excuse us." Illya turned away with a friendly wave, while Griselda lingered for a heartbeat. Her eyes locked onto Jay's one last time as those blue eyes met with his dark hazel eyes. Then she followed Illya into the crowd. Lavinia stepped forward beside Jay, watching their retreating backs. "I think she knew." "Yeah," Jay replied, his eyes following the strand of mana he had planted. Meanwhile, as they walked away from the crowd, Illya found himself on the receiving end of a sharp scolding from Griselda. "Do you have any idea who that girl was, Illya?" she hissed, her voice low but stern. "That was the Ice Princess of Grauzauberer, the wielder of absolute demise." Really?" Illya asked, looking genuinely surprised. While he was the strongest human in Heaven's arsenal, he wasn't exactly known for keeping up with the intricate social hierarchies of the supernatural world. He scratched the back of his head, feeling a bit embarrassed to have missed such a high-ranking individual standing right in front of him. "Then what about Illya-san?" Illya asked, his face full of curiosity. "Your friend probably lied about his name because I have never heard of a high-level operative named Illya in any of our records," Griselda answered flatly. No, he wasn't lying. I'm sure of it, Delio insisted. He had a knack for reading people, and he hadn't sensed a single trace of deception in the young man's words. Then he is probably... Griselda trailed off. She had her own channels of information, and whispers of the incident in Japan had already begun to circulate among the elite. The death of a major god like Susanu wasn't something that could be kept quiet for long. If there was a man traveling alongside the Ice Princess, then there was only one conclusion to draw. The Scorch Magician. The Godslayer. Let's just meet with everyone, Griselda said, cutting the conversation short as they approached one of the buildings. Pastor Cristaldi has called us. Tonight we move. That evening, after carefully analyzing what little information they had gathered, Jay and Lavinia decided to return to Transylvania. The region itself was massive. It was nearly 120 times larger than Kyoto. Jay's good old strategy of wide-range teleportation combined with domain scanning, the same strategy that he used to found Lavinia, would be nothing more than a reckless waste of mana here. Instead, they narrowed their search to 3 possible locations. Based on the information they had, which are the rumors of a vampire world hidden beneath forests and mountains, then there were only 2 truly logical choices. The first was the Apusini Mountains, a region riddled with caves, abandoned mines, and Jay's childhood stories about forgotten settlements where entire communities could vanish without leaving a trace. The second was the forests of the Eastern Carpathians. It was known by the local folklore as an ancient dense canopy steeped in old magic that predated modern civilization. And finally, Saigasora, an old fortified city steeped in history and legend. More importantly, it was the only place explicitly mentioned in one of the vampire-related texts Lavinia had found in Glenda's library. Unlike the vague references to mountains and forests, Saigasora was named clearly as it is the birthplace of Vlad the Impaler. It also helped that Jay had been here before. The sun was already setting when they arrived, its orange glow spilling across the stone-paved streets. Medieval walls and rooftops basked in the dying light, shadows stretching long and quiet. Jay and Lavinia teleported from point to point across the city. At each stop, Jay expanded his domain of his own, letting it brush against the fabric of reality, while Lavinia focused on detecting even the faintest fluctuation of mana. Nothing here either, Lavinia said, appearing in a flurry of snowflakes behind Jay. Jay stood near a cobblestone path as the distant tolling of a church bell echoed through the valley. He stared at the scenery, the long shadows of the medieval towers and the flickering street lamps. Ilyakuin? Is something wrong? Jay's hazel eyes remained fixed on the horizon. Sister Andrea had brought him here 7 years ago to sell the milk from their small farm. 7 years. He thought. But this city never changed. Nothing, he said quietly. It just reminds me of something. Lavinia stepped closer and gently took his hand, her silence offering the understanding he didn't need to put into words. Before Jay could respond, a sharp crystalline ripple of magic brushed against the edge of his domain. Jay's eyes snapped open. Lavinia felt it too, as a sudden unnatural pressure in the atmosphere. Without a word, their figures vanished in a flicker of purple embers. They reappeared atop a high-tiled roof overlooking a narrow alleyway. Below them, the world was frozen. The falling leaves were suspended in midair, and the flickering light of a broken lamp was held in a static hum. Localized time stop, Lavinia whispered, removing her glasses. Who has the magic to do this? I don't know, but it's possibly a sacred gear, Jay replied, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. In the center of the frozen alley was a girl, or perhaps a boy with girlish features, panting heavily. Meanwhile, the boy felt his stamina draining with every passing second. He had been running for what felt like hours, not away from danger at first, but away from the red-haired and black-haired girls who had brought him back to life. He had run because he wanted to meet Valerie. He wanted her to know that he was still alive, that he had not disappeared forever. But before he could even get close, everything went wrong. Now he was being hunted by those vampires instead. He might have been ungrateful for abandoning the girls who saved him, but fear and desperation drowned out reason. If he stopped, if he hesitated even for a moment, he knew he would never reach Valerie at all. I want to meet Valerie. I have to tell her I'm still alive, the boy thought, his legs trembling. He was a coward, he knew that. He was terrified of the vampires hunting him, but with this strange new power, he felt a flicker of hope. Suddenly, he tripped over a loose cobblestone, slamming into the dirt. Ouch! The impact broke his concentration. The world lurched back into motion as the leaves fell and the lamp flickered. But the relief was short-lived. An ominous, heavy mana surged from the end of the alley as a bounded field snapped shut around the area, sealing him in. No. The boy voice trembling. He crouched on the ground, shivering as a small leak of liquid stained the pavement beneath his skirt. He was paralyzed with fear. 6 or 7 cloaked figures emerged from the darkness, their eyes glowing like rubies. A time stop, one of them sneered, his voice cold. A valuable power indeed, but with the Grail in our hands, your presence is nothing but a hindrance to his plan, gasped Vladi. One of the vampire lunged, moving in a dark red flash of lethal speed. The boy called Gasper squeezed his eyes shut. Valerie, I'm sorry. Shriik. The sound of severed flesh echoed through the alley, followed by a heavy silence. Gasper waited for the pain, but it never came. He slowly opened his eyes and saw a broad back clad in a black coat standing before him. The man had one hand casually tucked into his pocket, while the other held a platinum-hued holy sword that pulsed with a faint dying light. The vampire who had rushed him lay on the ground, his body cleaved cleanly into two. Who? Gasper started, but he was suddenly pulled into a warm embrace from behind. Are you okay? A soft voice asked. A beautiful woman with blonde hair and deep blue eyes looked down at him with genuine worry. Jay stared down at the wounded vampire, his expression cold. Strange. How is a holy sword not affecting him at all? Jay wondered. The vampire was groaning from pain, but the holy energy from Sister Andrea's holy sword wasn't incinerating him as it should have. It's peculiar. The remaining vampires halted, their predatory confidence vanishing. Human? Who are you? One hissed. This is none of your business. That boy belongs to us. Jay glanced back at Gasper, who was shaking his head in terror. Doesn't look like he wants to go with you to me, Jay said, his voice flat. He stepped forward and a flicker of purple embers erupted from the ground beneath the fallen, severed vampire. Fum! The purple flames roared to life. The vampire's screams were cut short as his body turned to ash in seconds. Jay noticed a slight resistance as the vampire's body was unnaturally durable. But Incinerate Anthem was one of the original 13 Longinus for a reason. Any resistance was ultimately futile. The cloaked figures recoiled, their faces draining of color as shock rippled through them. There was no one in the supernatural world who would not recognize those violet embers. Those flames. Incinerate Anthem? One of them shouted in disbelief. Damn it. Retreat. They turned to flee, but to Jay their vampire speed was little more than a crawl, pitifully slow compared to a literal god of lightning he had faced in Kyoto. Jay banished the holy sword back into his pocket dimension. In one seamless motion, he reached into a tear in space and drew forth a jet-black blade. Aim no Habakiri blade pulsed with a dark hue as it tore the space around it. As violet flames danced along the blade's dark edge, Jay swung it in a lazy horizontal arc and he whispered. Cleave. Sheeing. Arg. A deafening scream was swallowed by the bounded field as a massive arc of violet light tore through the cloaked figures in an instant. In the next heartbeat, blazing purple flames erupted from the slash, consuming them in agonizing holy fire. Their bodies were cleaved apart and reduced to drifting ash, erased before their remains could even touch the ground. Jay looked empty space where the vampires had stood, his gaze hollow and distant. And then Aim no Habakiri disappeared into thin air, before he turned to the boy behind him. Gasper stared at Jay, his eyes wide with awe. The terror that had gripped him only moments ago was replaced by a single, overwhelming thought. So cool. Chapter 44, Courage. The first thing Gasper noticed after the battle ended was the silence. The air still shimmering with the residual heat of the violet flames as Jay looked down at the small boy huddled on the cold cobblestones. Gasper Vladi's face was a frantic mask of crimson as he looked from Jay to the damp patch on his skirt. Shivering from both the autumn chill and the sheer terror of what just happened, the boy tried to cover himself as his small hands trembling. Lavinia was the first to move. She knelt beside him, her long blonde hair falling over her shoulders like a curtain of silk. Her blue eyes were soft and radiating a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the biting night air. It's okay, she whispered, her voice a soothing melody. You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you. Jay, however, remained standing, his gaze piercing. He wasn't just looking at the boy. He was analyzing the aura radiating from him. The magical imprint was a chaotic, jarring mess. There was the clear, familiar scent of humanity, and also there a metallic tang of a vampire and something else. A dark, cloying weight that Jay recognized with a jolt of visceral memory. It was the energy of a devil. It reminded him Berjekwel. A devil magical imprint? Jay wondered, his eyes narrowing as he analyzing the magical imprints and the aura emanated from the little boy's body. Lavinia helped Gasper to his feet, her touch gentle as she brushed the dust from his shoulders. "Tell us, little one, what is your name?" "Gasper." "Gasper Vladi," the boy stammered, his voice barely a breath. He looked up at Jay, but the moment his eyes met those dark hazel eyes that felt like they were peering into the very bottom of his heart, he flinched. Jay's gaze was like a void. Instinctively, Gasper grabbed Lavinia's hand, hiding behind her like a shield. Jay realized then that he was looming over the boy like a predator. He consciously relaxed his shoulders, shoving his hands back into his coat pockets. "How is it that you have devil energy within you?" Jay asked. The question was blunt, cutting through the air. Gasper's bottom lip trembled. I don't know. Those girls, they did something. I was dead and then I wasn't." "Illya, you're scaring him," Lavinia chided softly, giving Jay a pointed look before turning back to Gasper with a smile. "I'm sorry, Illya isn't very good with words. He's actually quite nice once you get to know him." Jay exhaled slowly and looked away. "I'm sorry. Let's find a better place to talk." And with a sudden flicker of purple embers, the space folded around them. The alleyway was empty before the leaves could settle back to the ground. Minutes later, the silence of the alley was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps. Two figures burst into the area, their eyes searching the shadows. The first was a young girl, perhaps around 14 years old, with striking crimson hair and emerald eyes that glowed with a desperate intensity. Beside her stood a girl with long midnight black hair tied in a ponytail and violet eyes that scanned the surroundings in worry. The figures were none other than Rias Gremory and Akino Himejima. "I swear I detected the magic here," Rias exclaimed, her voice laced with desperation. "Gasper? Gasper, where are you?" She had reincarnated the boy only a week ago. It had been an act of impulsive pity. She had found him broken and dying after a brutal encounter with an exorcist, and the Gremory pride demanded she save a life so cruelly discarded. But she hadn't expected the boy to be so traumatized that he would flee the moment he regained his strength. "There is no one here, Rias," the black-haired girl Akino said softly. She walked toward the center of the alley, her eyes landing on a strange sight. Among the pristine cobblestones lay several piles of fine gray ash. Akino knelt, rubbing the soot between her fingers. Her violet eyes clouded with confusion. "What is this?" she muttered. "There's no trace of holy energy, but there is a lingering heat. Something turned several high-tier vampires into dust in a matter of seconds." Rias joined her, looking at the ash with a sinking feeling in her gut. Did the church find him? Or did the Teeps catch up? "Neither," Akino replied, looking up at the sky. "Whatever did this, it's far beyond a common exorcist." Far from the dark alley, the atmosphere was much warmer. They had relocated to a small, secluded restaurant at the edge of the city. The interior was cozy, filled with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread. Gasper sat across from Jay and Lavinia. Since Gasper was a damper, not a full-breed vampire, the cold of the Romanian autumn still affected him, and his previous clothes had been wetted. Jay and Lavinia decided to buy him some clothes and stopped at a local clothier before coming here. Initially, Lavinia wanted to buy him a dress, but Jay interjected, saying that a boy should not wear a skirt. Instead, he bought Gasper a hoodie, a jacket, and a pair of trousers, with the hoodie in particular meant to hide his pointed ears. Now Gasper sat shyly picking at a bowl of warm stew. Jay watched him for a long moment before speaking. "So, Gasper," Jay began. "Hayek." Gasper's body jolted, his spoon clattering against the bowl. "Don't be scared," Jay assured him, his voice steady. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to understand why those vampires were hunting you. They seemed convinced you belonged to them." Gasper looked down at his stew, his hands gripping the table. "I know. They are bad people." Gasper's hands trembled as he held the warm ceramic bowl, the steam rising to obscure his downcast eyes. He began to speak, his voice thin and fragile. "Valerie and I, we weren't like the other vampires," Gasper whispered. "In the Teeps castle, if your blood isn't pure, you aren't a person. You're a mistake. They kept me in the sub-basement, away from the moonlight. They told us that the sun would hate us even more than they did. He looked up then, a small, jarring smile touching his lips. It was a forced expression, meant to hide the tremor in his voice, but it only served to highlight the hollow look in his eyes. Valerie was different. She was the daughter of the king, so she lived in the main castle, but she was a half-breed too. She said that even with her status, the others whispered behind her back. She was lonely, so she would sneak down to my cell. She brought me food, books, and sometimes her own clothes to make me dress up with her so we could pretend to be twins. She was the only person who ever looked at me like I was a person. Gasper said. Across the table, Jay remained perfectly still, but the air around him began to hum with a low, dangerous frequency. He stared at Gasper's tragic smile. He's just like Valley, Jay thought. Trapped by the weight of a lineage that only sees them as tools or stains. A child never chooses to be born, yet they are so often the ones forced to bear the weight of existence simply for having come into the world. Without Jay moving a muscle, the water glass in his hand began to glow with a faint violet hue, and in the next moment both the cup and the hot black tea within it evaporated into a rising mist. Surprised Lavinia and Gasper. "Keep talking, Gasper," Jay said. His voice had dropped an octave. Gasper flinched at the intensity but saw that Jay's anger wasn't directed at him. "I was the one who decided to run. I couldn't take the basement anymore. I worked up the courage to tell Valerie I wanted to leave, and she didn't try to stop me. She even helped me. She used her position and knowledge of the castle to get us past the inner gates and into the forest." He swallowed hard, his eyes glazing over as the memory shifted to the blood on the cobblestones. But then that man appeared. The exorcist. He didn't care that Valerie and I was just a kid. He just called us filth and swung his sword. Valerie stood in front of me, and suddenly she pulled out this golden cup. A chalice that shone like a fragment of the sun. It felt so warm and everything went white. Jay and Lavinia exchanged a sharp, knowing look. There was no doubt now. The mentioned golden chalice was one of the 13 Longinus, the Sephiroth Graal. The same thing that bring Glenda here in the first place. The exorcist didn't care, Gasper continued, his voice shaking. He lunged for her and I couldn't let him. And the last thing I remember are the coldness of the sword. As the boy recounted the sensation of the blade piercing his chest, his breathing became shallow. Lavinia immediately stood up, moving to the chair beside him and pulling the small boy into a protective hug. "She helped me and I couldn't even protect her," Gasper sobbed into her coat. Jay stared at the boy. "You are brave, Gasper," Jay said, and he meant every word. "Don't be ashamed of that. Running away from abuse takes courage in itself, and you even sacrificed yourself for the people you love. You are braver than most people, even me." His voice softened at the last words. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing to act despite it. And yet, Jay thought as that night resurfaced in his memory, I am nothing but a coward. Gasper went on to explain that after that moment, he suddenly found himself alive again, waking in an unfamiliar room where two devil girls greeted him. Reincarnated devil, a peerage, Lavinia realized, exchanging a brief glance with Jay. Now it made sense. That was the source of the devil energy they had sensed within Gasper. After that, the vampires started chasing me, Gasper continued softly. And thanks to you, Ilya-san, Lavi-san, I'm safe now. With those words, Gasper finished his story. Then this war is a complicated three-way war. Jay leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. His gaze darkened. The slaughter of Susiava wasn't random act of killing from them, it was retaliation. If Valerie awakened the Graal to save you and believed you died, that grief would have been unbearable. He exhaled slowly. The Teeps faction likely used that moment to justify the massacre of the church's base in Susiava. Gasper shook his head frantically. No. Valerie wouldn't do that. She's kind. She's the kindest person I know. She would never ask for people to be killed. I know, Gasper, Lavinia said softly, patting his head in reassurance. Illya Kovalenko is only speaking hypothetically. It may not have been Valerie at all. Others could be using her power for their own ends. Jay fell silent, turning the thought over in his mind. Was it the Graal? Was that why holy power no longer affected them? If that's true, then what is the full extent of its capabilities? He thought. Thinking about it is pretty scary. Lavinia had said that the Sephiroth Graal was a device that governed the laws of life and death. But that description was maddeningly vague. She looked at Jay, her expression grave. If a Longinus like the Graal has emerged in the Teeps faction, then the status quo is gone. The Carmilla faction will be forced to respond, and the church is probably already on its way. Jay nodded. What had started as a search for Glenda had transformed into a three-way Holy Grail war between the church, Teeps faction, and Carmilla faction. What does Glenda want to do with the Graal anyway? Jay wondered. Then he looked at Gasper and spoke. Gasper, Jay said, his voice firm but no longer intimidating. Can you guide us to the vampire world? Gasper looked at Jay, then at Lavinia. He felt the warmth of the hoodie, the weight of the warm food in his stomach, and the lingering sense of the purple flames that had saved him. I'll try, Gasper said, nodding slowly. I'll show you the way to the castle. Chapter 45, Tempest. The eastern Carpathian forests were shrouded in an unnatural bone-chilling fog that seemed to swallow sound itself. Tall pines stood in silent as their needles frosted with the early morning rime of autumn. In a small clearing, hidden beneath layers of holy concealment magic, a campfire crackled. The orange flames licked at the damp air, casting long flickering shadows against the trees. It was 5 a.m. To the human world it was the break of dawn. But to the inhabitants of the shadow world beneath the mountains, it was the start of their evening, the time when the nocturnal nobility typically began to stir. The church had chosen this specific hour to strike, intending to catch the creatures of the night while they were at their most sluggish, preparing for their day. Around the dying fire, 5 individuals sat in a heavy contemplative silence. Beyond the clearing, the forest was alive with the hushed movements of hundreds of other exorcists. They moved with practiced military precision, their modified priest attires rustling softly. Each wore an exorcist battle suit, a high-tech black garment reinforced with lightweight, silver-etched armor hidden beneath the sacred cloth. Dilio Gesualdo sat on a mossy log, his blonde hair messy and his expression deceptively relaxed. He watched the embers dim, his vibrant green eyes reflecting the fading warmth. "So it is confirmed then," Dilio said, his voice cutting through the silence with a casualness that belied the gravity of the current situation. Beside him, Griselda Quarta nodded slowly. She wore her nun's habit layered over her battle suit, her posture rigid and professional. "According to our scouts who engaged the retreating stragglers near Susiava, there is no mistaking it. The traditional weaknesses of the vampire race, as we have known them since the old days, such as holy energy, consecrated silver, and direct light, have been severely mitigated, if not entirely nullified in some individuals. To think the Holy Grail is truly capable of rewriting the laws of an entire race," Dilio muttered, a rare frown touching his lips. "And to have the audacity to remain in the town after what they've just done." Diethelm Waldsmuller, a tall black-haired man in his mid-30s with a thick, well-groomed beard, shifted his weight. His priest vestments were heavy with the weight of hidden weaponry. As a healer he needed that just in case. He had traveled all the way from Cologne Cathedral, Germany, and his skepticism was visible in the way he gripped his prayer beads. "It is a Longinus for a reason, Gesualdo," Diethelm said, his voice deep and gravelly. "But I don't believe it is as potent as yours. A cup of blood can only do so much against the law of heavens themselves." He paused, looking toward the middle-aged man leading the group. "Why aren't we bringing the Durandal wielder for this, Pastor Cristaldi? If we are facing these gods-tier artifacts, we should be bringing our own heavy hitters." Griselda interjected before the pastor could speak, her voice sharpening as she mentioned her protégé. "Zenobia is still too young. She and Irina are working harder than anyone, but for a mission of this magnitude, invading the heart of the vampire territories, it would be a suicide mission for them. They barely survived an encounter with a vampire noble a few months ago," she thought. The fifth member of the group, a young woman with voluptuous body, ashen blonde hair and mesmerizing gray eyes, sat quietly. Marana Shadorova was a sestra of the Russian Orthodox Church. Her chest was heavy with anxiety, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted her black sister outfit. Surrounded by these legendary figures of the church, she felt like a small bird caught in a gathering storm. "Miss Shadorova," Dilio said, his cheerful mask sliding back into place as he held out a stick. "Would you like a marshmallow? It's important to keep your sugar up before a war." Marana blinked, looking at the fluffy white confection and then at Dilio's genuine smile. Thank you, Dilio, that is very kind of you. The leader of the operation, Ewald Cristaldi, sat silently in the center of the group, his black hair peppered with gray, his face illuminated by the final flicker of the fireplace. The silence fell again, only to be broken by a priest who materialized from the shadows behind Cristaldi. The messenger bowed to send a whisper. Pastor Cristaldi, the southern perimeter of the Carmilla faction's territory has been breached. We are ready to begin the operation. Cristaldi opened his eyes slowly. The weariness was gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fire. He stood up, and the air around him seemed to hum with holy authority. 567 of our brothers and sisters were slaughtered by these filthy creatures in Susiava, Cristaldi stated, his voice ringing out through the clearing. By the grace of the Lord, tonight we bring justice to their souls. Dilio stood up as well, brushing the dirt from his pants. But Pastor, we still haven't confirmed which faction was responsible. The Teeps and the Carmilla have been at each other's throats for centuries. If we strike the wrong one, we might just be doing the other side a favor. It doesn't matter, Cristaldi said, his voice devoid of mercy. He gripped the hilt of his holy sword, the metal gleaming with a faint, lethal radiance. They are all pests in the garden of the Lord. Tonight we clean this earth of these pests entirely. He turned to look at Dilio. And as we discussed, can you handle the northern castle alone, Zenith Tempest? Dilio popped the marshmallow into his mouth, chewing it with a thoughtful expression before giving a casual thumbs up. Of course. With a brief nod to Griselda, Dilio stepped into a gold-etched teleportation circle and vanished in a flash of light. Ewald Cristaldi turned his attention to Griselda, Diethelm and Marana. Around 3,000 exorcists had been mobilized from across Europe for this campaign. To some it seemed like a small number to take on the entire vampire race, but Cristaldi knew better. These were the elite, the fanatical and the blessed. The sky is with us tonight, Ewald declared, looking up through the canopy at the dark clouds. They have existed in the shadows for far too long. Tonight we bring the light. Let's clean this place. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the north, a lone man walked across a bridge of black stone. The city of the Carmilla faction was a marvel of dark, extravagant architecture. It was a sprawling metropolis of obsidian and marble, surrounded by towering walls that seemed to reach for the heavens. A perpetual mist clung to the streets. It was clearly some sort of magical barrier designed to keep the sun's rays from ever touching the pale skin of its inhabitants. At the heart of the city stood the main castle, a towering Gothic citadel that was carved directly into the mountainside. Its spires pierced the mist like jagged spears, each one crowned with iron gargoyles that had been worn smooth by centuries of rain and blood. The stained glass windows of the fortress glimmered with violet and blood-red hues, depicting scenes of forgotten rituals that had been erased from the history of mankind. Dilio stopped at the end of the bridge, looking up at the gargantuan structure. Let's finish this quickly, Dilio whispered to the wind. He raised his right hand toward the heavens. Zenith Tempest, he commanded. The sky reacted instantly. The dark clouds began to swirl and churn, turning a brilliant, blinding white. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a matter of seconds. White particles began to fall, the mists that protected the Carmilla territory corroded like ice particles. Dilio walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the sudden terrified silence of the city. Above him the sky raged in a grayish clouds. The second strongest Longinus, the prison of bright heavenly thunder, Zenith Tempest had been unleashed. And that early morning snow began to fall in the middle of autumn over the sky of Romania. The transition from the warmth of the restaurant to the jagged wilderness of the Carpathian Mountains was a violent assault on the senses. The teleportation circle bloomed beneath their feet in a muted violet glow, lines of complex runes overlapping and correcting themselves in real time. Unlike Jay's usual instantaneous jumps, this one took effort. Teleporting to a place you had never set foot in was already difficult. Teleporting into a territory that actively erased itself from human perception was something else entirely. The vampire territories were shielded by layers of ancient spatial distortion and perception-altering mists. Gasper said controlling mists are one of their native properties. They were sovereign pockets of reality, invisible to satellite imagery and human travelers alike. Only with the help of Lavinia's own spatial magic and Gasper's vague, fragmented memories of the landscape was Jay able to finish the teleportation. The smell of pine hit him first, mixed with damp earth and something faintly metallic. Snow crunched softly beneath their boots as they emerged into a dense forest at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains. Towering pines rose like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with frost. Lavinia exhaled slowly, adjusting her glasses. "We made it." Gasper looked around with wide eyes. "Yes. This is it. The forest behind Teep's territory." Suddenly, Jay reached out and caught a drifting flake on his hand. He watched it for a heartbeat before his eyes narrowed. "This snow," he muttered. It was too heavy, too structured. Even without his domain expanded, he could feel the dense concentration of mana woven into the crystal. This isn't a natural phenomenon. He closed his eyes for a moment, reaching out to the microscopic strand of mana he had planted on Sister Griselda back in the city. He could feel it clearly now. She was on the move and she wasn't far from here. "Illya, look at the way the mist is reacting," Lavinia said, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. She pointed toward the sky, where the fog was being systematically shredded by a localized blizzard. The ability to overwrite a climate and weather to this extreme degree, there is only one thing capable of it. It's Zenith Tempest. "So it really is the church then," Jay said, his expression hollow. "But why aren't they here yet? Don't tell me they don't know which faction holds the Grail." Lavinia frowned, thinking it through. "They can't be careless enough to charge in without gathering information first, unless," she paused, her voice lowering, "they intend to strike both factions and simply don't care who they hit first." "Probably a little bit of both," Jay agreed. He turned his back to the towering walls of Teep's territory. "The church's move shouldn't concern us at this moment. We have our own objective." Gasper, who had been huddled between them, suddenly pointed toward a mound of earth near the forests. Around 100 meters away, a crude wooden structure marked the entrance to some kind of tunnel. "There," Gasper whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. "That's the tunnel. It's the one Valerie and I used to run away from the castle. It connects the sub-basement directly to the outer woods." "There are guards," Jay noted. His domain brushed against the area, detecting 4 distinct magical imprints. "They were vampires, an aggressive one at that." "They must have guarded it after I escaped," Gasper slumped, his shoulders shaking. "Valerie probably got in trouble because of me." Jay didn't respond with words. He stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the frozen needles. He didn't bother with stealth. With a sharp crack in the air, the pitch-black blade of Habakiri manifested in his hand, its surface rippling with violet flames that refused to give off light. He didn't even break his stride, and with a single casual flick of his wrist, Jay whispered, "Cleave." A silent arc of purple light tore through the distance almost instantaneously. The 4 vampires standing guard at the tunnel entrance didn't even have time to turn their heads. The slash passed through them and the wooden fortifications alike. In the next heartbeat, their bodies erupted into violet cinders, consumed by the Incinerate Anthem before they could even register the sensation of being cut. Gasper stood frozen, his mouth hanging open in a silent gasp of awe. "How? Illya-san. That was incredible. Can you teach me to do that?" Jay didn't look back. He simply exhaled a plume of mist into the cold air. Lavinia offered Gasper a small smile, patting his head. "Focus on the path for now, Gasper. Let's go." They teleported there before slipped into the entrance and began their descent into the earth. The tunnel was cramped and damp, its walls slick with age, exhaling the stench of rotting timber and stagnant water. This was no passage meant for nobility or ceremony. It had been carved for discretion, for the quiet movement of things that were never meant to be seen. With every step downward, the air grew heavier. The humidity thickened until it clung to their skin as a metallic tang crept into their mouths. Jay expanded his domain and letting it brush against the darkness ahead. But for the first time in a very long while, something twisted in his chest. Not anger. Not even hatred. Revulsion. "We've reached the basement levels," Gasper said, trying to sound brave. "This is where I lived." The tunnel opened into a vast subterranean cavern that had been converted into a nightmare. It was a sprawling network of iron cages and stone confinement cells. Inside, Dampiers, children and adults alike sat in the filth, their bodies skeletal and their eyes devoid of anything resembling hope. But it wasn't just the half-breeds. There are humans too. He saw pregnant women chained to the walls like livestock, and rows of small girls with the hollowed-out expressions. The stench of blood and human secretion was overwhelming. Lavinia's face went pale. She clutched her stomach, a wave of nausea threatening to overcome her. She reached out, her hand trembling as she gripped the sleeve of Jay's black coat. "Illya Kovalenko," she whispered, her voice cracking with horror. She looked at Jay, terrified that the sight of such calculated cruelty would shatter his precarious composure. Jay stood perfectly still. He didn't move to comfort her, nor did he lash out in a blind rage. He simply stood there, his gaze empty and cold as the void. "Lavinia," Jay said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Try to look for Glenda. I will take Gasper with me to find Valerie." "No, Jay," she replied immediately, stepping closer. "Let's stay together." Jay finally turned his head. His eyes met hers. "It's okay, Lavia," Jay said, his tone strangely soft. "Let me handle this." As he said that, Jay turned. His gaze was cold and unwavering. In that moment, there was only a single thought left in his mind. Kill them all.